do this. We're going to have people who haven't watched wrestling in 27 years tune into this, see the old MSG show from 72. I mean, it was just ridiculous. So
people who don't even like wrestling are going to say this is too good of a deal to pass up.
They said when you drive down the street, 8 out of 9 homes are WWE homes. We have statistics to prove it, and we're going to get 7 out of those 8 to get the network, and it's just like, no, come on, this is crazy. But they are still, I mean, it sounds like they want 2 to 3 million subscribers. I don't. This idea that they should continue to grow at the rate they did over the next 12 months, that they should grow at the same rate again, the idea that if the growth rate slows, that it's some sort of indictment of WWE and the network formula or their booking. No, it's just common sense. Everybody has a car. They don't need to buy new cars now. So if cars were invented last year, sales of cars would be really big. But then after that, it would be a while before we saw a lot of sales again because cars last a while. The people who didn't have the network now have it. The ones who were interested have it. Obviously, there's a diminishing number. There's some people out there who they're trying to get to convert, but I just don't expect to see 1.7 million a year from now. I don't think they'll grow by the same number as they did in the last 12 months, Todd.
And the key to the thing is that there are only so many people that are particularly interested in today's WWE product.
Yeah.
I think there still is a base of wrestling fans who aren't really being served by today's WWE product.
Yeah.
But I think in order to get them back, you need to make a better product. I don't think you're going to be able to get them just based on the historical interest. And with your example with cars, I mean that's the key with cars is that anyone can use a car. Like it's something that has universal appeal, whereas WWE only has appeal with a particular niche of people. And so that sort of thing is even less likely to have a long sort of growth, because there's only a finite number of people that you're starting with the target audience. Whereas with another thing that you're spending a lot of money on, people will trickle in over time because you're just dealing with a larger base. So yeah, I continue to be down on the likelihood of long-term growth and in terms of the long-term numbers. But hey, I underestimated in this past year the number of people that would drop off, because clearly WWE has convinced people that are ordering the network that there's a good value in the month-to-month product, more than just the old pay-per-view model where you just had the pay-per-view and that was worth whatever you would pay for. People see a value in continuing to subscribe to the WWE network, and they put a lot of good stuff on the WWE network, and they try to continually put stuff out there that people will be interested in. So I think there is the potential to retain people at a higher level than I once thought possible, but I don't see where the additional subscribers will come from, short of a Roman Reigns fueled popularity explosion,
or Roman Reigns being exploded.
What a mean thing to say.
I thought you were going that way at first. I'm like, that's horrible, and then I realized you didn't, and it was just me being horrible.
People will tune in to see this man exploded. That's terrible. I wouldn't mind seeing the man on my television less, but he should live, Wade.
I agree.
Should live.
I agree. He's not like some people reacted to Scalia's death, where it's just little, you got to give it a few minutes before we. I was
going to bring up we can get apolitical and just agree that that John Cena would be a lot more people would be a lot more agreeable to John Cena blowing up.
Oh God, I don't know how to transition to this, but we did not bring up Goldust interrupting the date with our truth, and I really did want to get your thoughts on this. What the hell? What? Why? What? What are they? Why?
It's Vince McMahon comedy. What do you want? It's terrible programming. It's going to lead to absolutely nothing positive. The segments are a disaster each and every week. But what do you want from me? I'm not putting it on.
I know. And why?
It's not my fault.
And why is a camera filming R-Truth on a date anyway? Well, I guess he could. No, there's no explanation. Anyway, all right.
Well, yeah, maybe it was like a hidden camera or something, or Goldust. Goldust has been following them, telling them to follow a cameraman because he's gonna, present it again, the opportunity to tag.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I should have just left it alone. All right. Do you want to go to a mailbag question or two, or do you want to wrap up with USC right now?
Either way is fine. What do you want to do?
Let's take a mailbag question. This came in today from Sean D. Says, hi, Wade and Todd. I'm writing in response to your dismissal of the notion that Titus O'Neil's punishment for grabbing Vince McMahon was racially motivated. I think your judgment is rooted in a pretty simplistic idea of what racism is and how it functions. We know two big things from social science research on racial bias. One, people of color are routinely punished more harshly than white people for the same offenses. This happens very clearly in the criminal justice system, but also, for instance, in schools. There's lots and lots of implicit bias out there. Study after study has shown that, to give some examples, the same resume gets different attention if the name on it seems black to the person reading it, or that police and simulations are more likely to shoot at figures who appear African American than those who appear white. I think sociologists consider the evidence of these two things to be more or less rock solid. Now there seems to be a pretty universal agreement that O'Neill's punishment was excessive. There is also, and Todd to his credit pointed this out, plenty of evidence from his booking that McMahon has explicit racial bias going on. Given all this, it seems to me very far from ridiculous to conclude with a pretty high degree of confidence that O'Neill's punishment is linked to his race. When confronted like things like this, we, and in this case you, tend to imagine that racism only functions when someone consciously and maliciously decides to treat a person of color badly. If that were the case, the effects of racism would be considerably more diminished in our culture than they actually are. I have no idea what McMahon's thought process actually were. I have a pretty good idea that a white wrestler would not have been punished as harshly as O'Neill was. If we deny any racial injustice on the basis that we don't believe the perpetrator of that injustice actually, with complete clarity of thought, decided to be racist, then we lose sight of the persistence of actual racism in the world around us. Todd, that's the end of his questions. It's transitioned from, the way our truth is portrayed, and also a transition away from trying to be apolitical. Your thoughts on that?
Oh man, he's attacking me in my soft spot here. Because this is a point that I have often made over the years about implicit biases. And having taken plenty of critical race studies courses in college and in law school, I'm well aware of these sorts of studies. And I even sort of gave it a little bit of lip service in terms of the way that different people are perceived in different contexts. I would say that I still don't buy it in the context of Titus O'Neill specifically, because I think that those sorts of things are more likely to manifest themselves when you're dealing with people that are unknown. When you're dealing with, the poster of a generic, the picture of a generic person, when a police officer is dealing with someone that they have not encountered before. But I think when you're dealing with individuals who you do know, that those sorts of biases can manifest themselves in different ways and different assumptions. And I don't think that Vince McMahon, in dealing with Roman Reigns, is more likely to view Titus O'Neil as being dangerous or menacing, which is sometimes, which is one of the sorts of biases that are going to come up there. I don't think that was affecting his thinking. I think he was more just annoyed at the timing of it and annoyed that someone was touching him. And I don't think race really came. I don't think that's a thought that's particularly racialized in nature in terms of the way that he's looking at it. So, I mean, my critique of it was much more in the context of what specifically happened on that Monday night, as opposed to sort of a broader critique of the way those sorts of things can play a role. But as I said, I mean, you're attacking your sauce money. I really don't like making an argument against that, because a lot of people make arguments against those things, and I'm a believer in the generalized point that you're making. I don't buy that it played a role to any significant degree with Vince McMahon and Titus O'Neil. Now, if the context were slightly different, I could imagine it playing more of a role. I can imagine Vince McMahon having. Here's an example. I don't think that when Vince McMahon came up, I don't know if Vince McMahon came up with it, but when WWE came up with Crime Time or the Guerreros lying, cheating, and stealing, that those were intended to be harmful in any way. I think it was just what they perceived as being fun characters. The characters of Crime Time are just sort of these wacky hood guys that are getting into mischief and doing, random things, and they're baby faces. I don't think that it was intended to be, I don't think it was trying to exploit people's negative perceptions, like, say, the Gangstas in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Same thing with the Guerreros. It was a babyface gimmick to try to get them over as sort of these wacky troublemakers. With that said, clearly there are, underlying ideas about what sorts of people would be involved in a tag team called Crime Time, or who would be lying and cheating and stealing. And certain people would be more likely to be thought of in that light than other people on the basis of race. And so those sorts of implicit biases, I think, probably come up in various, contexts. There are all sorts of various negative stereotypes. When it came to Titus O'Neil grabbing Vince McMahon in that context, I just don't think that the way Vince McMahon interpreted that was something that entered into any underlying ideas he has about the way certain people act based on the way certain people look. And so that's why I thought the way I did about Titus O'Neil. What do you think, Wade?
Could, after the fact, I think it's a good discussion. I don't have... I dismissed the notion that it deserved the declarative headline in the New York Post and the silly Twitter comments that were just knee-jerk and kind of over the top. I think that there's a possibility that Vince McMahon's suspension was motivated in a way that he did not explicitly think in his own mind was a motivation of, I got shown up or embarrassed by... I'm trying to think of... Because I don't think he would say one of them. Like, I don't think in his head he'd think one of them. I don't think that's Vince McMahon. But I think there could have been, in a way that he would deny, a part of him that was more embarrassed by being corrected, especially if the phrase was, ladies first, that maybe a combination of factors that include race, but race wasn't the predominant one, affected the way Vince reacted to it. And I'm tiptoeing carefully because I think it's not something you throw around. It's not something that you throw around based on a broad statistical, history of studies and sociology, where you then, I think when you apply that accusation to somebody specifically in a specific situation with certainty, that's taking a broad conclusion and applying it, I think, unfairly specifically, as opposed to simply saying maybe, and it's part of the conversation. But I don't feel comfortable, and I don't sense that you did either last week, saying that with any certainty anybody could say that it was. I think the possibility's there, but drawing that conclusion, saying it out loud with a sense of certainty based on sociological studies, I think is unfair, frankly, to Vince McMahon in this specific situation.
Well, to be fair to him, and I'm now gonna turn attack dog on myself along with you. I think the point would be that yes, that's true about Vince McMahon, but his critique is that we were being very emphatic on the other side. So I mean, you could say yes.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's true.
You should say that it's wrong to say Vince McMahon emphatically is a racist, but his critique is we shouldn't be saying emphatically that he isn't in the way that he's doing. And I think the underlying point about racism being thought of way too often in the context of somebody with hate in their heart, saying negative things about someone else just on the basis of race, is not the way that racism tends to operate in 2016. It tends to operate much more subconsciously in terms of the suppositions we have and the way that we think about different people. And I think that underlying point is a very valid one, and I think it's one that people are better off. It would be better off considering in a lot of contexts when considering a variety of social issues that get brought up and frequently get dismissed. With that said, at the end of the day, I still don't really think. I still think pretty strongly that wasn't what was going on to any significant degree with Vince McMahon. But hey, I mean, I think it's a fair generalized point. As I say, I hate arguing. You know, you got me in a darn soft spot.
Well, and I think I don't think it's in defense. It's necessarily a effective defense of my stance, but I feel like I probably reacted the way that I did to New York Post declarative statement. These, the comments on Twitter that got way more attention than they deserved and weren't really grounded in intelligent, thoughtful email like this. And so kind of the reaction is, no, we're dealing with Vince McMahon. He's erratic. He doesn't like being shown up. And if you had told me a wrestler grabbed him and Vince overreacted and suspended him, I wouldn't have said, oh, I bet the guy was black. Like, I wouldn't have crossed my mind that, oh, a 90-day suspension, oh, that must mean it was a black guy. Like, it's just Vince. He's erratic. He's overreacts. So that kind of played into dismissing it. Like, this notion that somebody would have to have some not even repressed, but just this kind of silent at-work racism playing into it isn't needed in this scenario because it's Vince McMahon who just is. There's so many examples of him doing this type of thing in reaction to other things that have no consistent pattern of racism. To me, R-Truth and what they're doing with him on TV, very much more racist than a suspension to Titus O'Neil. So that's where my reaction was. But I do think standing here a week out and having read that letter and hearing you talk, I mean, I think you have to at least open up the possibility that, and it's fair to open up the possibility that played a role in the severity of it, or Vince maybe needing to be talked out of firing the guy because it was in public, and for some reason Vince felt more embarrassed that a black guy thought it was his place to grab the chairman by the arm in front of everybody like that. I mean, I guess I can't rule that out, but I certainly don't feel comfortable declaring it as obviously true or even likely true.
Well, I feel pathetic having groveled and backtracked. Let's move on to something else.
Fair enough. All right. Well, we have another letter on this topic, Todd. I was going to read it. I don't know if you're if you can hear it and then decide if you want to comment. Dan B says, on last week's show, you claimed that Vince McMahon probably reacted angrily to being shoved by Titus O'Neil because he's insecure and feels his position as WWE chairman is more tenuous than it was during the Monday Night Wars, and that ratings are sliding and his judgment is being questioned, so he's simply trying to reassert his dominance. I'm not quite sure I said that, but... or maybe did you say that, Todd? This was addressed to you.
This sounds like something I said.
Yeah, okay, good, because I was thinking he said, hi Wade, but it's hi Todd. Okay. My question is, could the opposite be true? And that Vince McMahon now feels invincible because he's, by the way, you can't go capital V INCE -able and then afterwards say no pun intended. You don't get to do that, Dan. My question is, could the opposite be true in that Vince McMahon now feels invincible, no pun intended, because he's eliminated all competition, whereas during the 1990s, he may have been more forgiving toward minor indiscretions, such as this, in case talent went running off to WCW. P.S. You struggle to recall the precise words spoken by Shad Gaspar that offended Stephanie McMahon for similar reasons. According to JTG's book, he annoyed her by addressing her with the words, "Hey, baby, how you doing?" Stephanie said she didn't mind if he referred to the Divas as baby, but not her.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that in various contexts. That I think there's confidence that Vince McMahon is able to really sort of exert his control over wrestlers because they have such dominance in the marketplace right now. And you can see in the way wrestlers act, they act in a much more, they're sort of scared. I mean, we brought up earlier in terms of my surprise at the Big Show. Wrestlers are frequently very scared to act because, Vince McMahon has such control. But I think ultimately in terms of reaction to individual acts, I really do think that when you react very strongly to minor issues, it's really very often a mark of insecurity. I think people that are secure in their position of power are much more likely to be more forgiving of indiscretions, and the more caught up you are in sort of paranoia of your position in the overall company, the more likely you are to lash out and to make examples of people, because it's a way to consolidate your power and to show people that you're not weak. I mean, there have been so many. I mean, this is the subject of so many great dramas over the years. Whether it's plays or movies or books. I mean, it's a common element of the human condition. So I do think there's something to Vince McMahon having added sort of power and added confidence of based on his position in the industry and the lack of competitors. But I think the fact that he's been quite unsuccessful in a lot of other ways, even having that power, sort of cuts in the other direction.
Moritz Nordlund emailed and said, please answer this one for the fix for people outside of the USA. Hulk Hogan says wrong word and he's fired, compared to John Jones, who takes illegal drugs, drives intoxicated into people, starts fights, drives without a license, cheats on his wife, and much more.
Well, I mean, obviously, people get treated differently depending upon how much money there's left in them. And John Jones has gotten a lot of second chances and third chances and fourth chances and fifth chances because of the fact that he's the best pound for pound fighter in the world, and UFC wants to feature him in big fights, and so that's given him license, just like in so many other athletes. Whereas Hogan, towards the end of his career, doesn't have that same power. And we saw with Hogan back, and granted it wasn't as bad in terms of what he was doing. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think probably on balance, the racist tapes are worse than his lying about steroid use. But I mean, I feel like there's an argument the other way, and that this was a hero to children who, for years and years was telling children to take their vitamins and you can look like me, and teaching kids about that, all the while taking lots of steroids and then lying about it publicly. I think that's a pretty terrible thing to do for someone that's supposed to be a model for children, as opposed to someone that's sort of a guy that's isn't an idol to children anymore because he's in his 50s and all those people have grown up and they're more aware of the world. Yes, Wade?
Yes, you're so good at that. And also with Hulk Hogan, there's another angle to it, which is he was claiming he didn't have an unfair advantage over the people he vied for top main event spots in his company and jobs. But, I didn't cheat. I didn't take steroids to get this body. And so there's this character on the air that he portrayed that he wanted people to believe had a level of authenticity to who he was as a real person, which is truth, justice, the American way. And he was, in kind of a Lance Armstrong type way, the way steroids were perceived back then, a cheater.
Yeah, although I would make the distinction when Lance Armstrong comes up. The worst thing about Lance Armstrong was the way that he destroyed people's lives who would speak out against him, and Hogan didn't have that element to it.
That's a good. Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah, not Lance Armstrong's so off the charts, awful in that way. It's when you're. Yeah, he wasn't out suing. Hogan wasn't out suing people who dared bring up the subject, but I think some of the things he said, about Billy Graham and Bruno and that. I mean, he fired back somewhat, but absolutely, I think it's a point we're taking that Lance took it to a new level in a different category. And I think you're right. I know you have more to say on it, but I think the biggest thought I had with this is I think Hogan. I think WWE would have tried to find a way to be more forgiving of Hogan than just firing him the next morning, essentially, if he was making them tens of millions of dollars.
Bingo, and that's exactly where I was going with it.
Yeah.
Was in the 90s when he was lying about the steroids. WWF brought him back relatively shortly. Actually, I'm forgetting the timeline of that. When was the Arsenio Hall? 1991. So yeah, he still would have been in WWF at that point. So he would have left the company the next year, but and then come back the year after that. So he was still being pushed in the WWF during that time period when he did that. Yeah. And granted, I think that was less than the racist tapes, but if the racist tapes had come out in WWF in 1991, I think it's an open question what they would have done. I mean, I think it's, I think they very well could have, I think they would have felt they had to keep him away for a little bit. Yeah. So it might have been one of those deals that Vince McMahon sometimes does where he says, go away for 6 months and we'll bring you back then.
It's a bigger story too, Todd. On that, it's kind of it's two things. One, WWE would have had more to lose, so they would have tried to find an angle to protect his job or suspend him on a short-term basis and bring him back. But the other aspect is the media would have been a lot more into it because he was more relevant. They would have been interviewing Mr. T, going, do you know he thought this about, blacks, and how do you feel about this? And he had just, co-hosted Saturday Night Live with Mr. T, and it would, I just think it would have been a bigger media storm. Even though Hogan was a newer celebrity, he was a much more relevant celebrity at that point than kind of the washed-up wrestler who's doing Rent-A-Center commercials.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that does play a role. The success in the success in that someone's having within the business playing a role in how they're going to be treated based on their indiscretions. With that said, I mean, it's also just you also just got different situations. I think John Jones is the DUI where he hit the pregnant woman, if I'm remembering it correctly, the details. I feel like that was, in terms of actually hurting people.
And stole her purse and took off her earrings.
Probably the worst of the bunch, but
yeah, that was.
Yeah, I don't know. It's difficult to compare different sorts of really negative things because I mean they're so bad in different ways, and it feels sort of silly to sort of try to rank what's worse. Saying terrible things or hurting an individual person because of your recklessness. It's like,
I think part of it sometimes is a reaction. I mean, as insincere as some people took it, John Jones apologized. He was contrite. He was like, it was a learning experience. So much has come at me so fast, and I mean, the cocaine feels so good. And
although
he didn't say that.
Lack of sincerity was probably a negative in that.
But you think it was a negative that he apologized?
No, the complete lack of sincerity was a negative in the apology.
But you give him credit for trying, maybe, where with Hogan, I don't know that I guess he eventually did the GM.
No, he did his fake apologies, too. They're both very good at insincere apologies. Yeah. That John Jones and Hulk Hogan have in common.
I do want to take an issue with Mr. Nordland's phrasing, because I felt the question was sort of, had a little bit of an agenda built into it, in the sense that he goes, Hogan says wrong word, and he's fired. This was not the word. If the word is removed and everything else is still there, it's pretty bad. Black people, African Americans, are not worthy of marrying my daughter unless they're rich and famous. Hey, son, in a jailhouse conversation, you and I are soulmates, but if we get reincarnated, I hope it's not as African Americans. I think that's pretty scandalous, too.
Yes, I think that's a safe statement.
Yes. So this idea that somebody who thinks, well, I've said the N-word before, and I don't think I should be fired, and, well, you're not a celebrity. You're not a celebrity who built your celebrity on being a role model to kids. There's not this built-in hypocrisy. Secondly, it's not the use of the N-word that's the totality or even the majority of the problem. It's the context of his comments, and I just have to sneak that in because it drives me nuts when people think that it's simply the use of the N-word and that what Vince did to John Cena in that silly skit 10 years ago counts as the same thing, and it couldn't be more different.
Well, to be fair, are there many people making that argument? Because I don't know if there are that many people really making that argument.
Well, I heard it enough. It was people tweeting it on YouTube. Hey, Vince should fire himself for this. But it's
now we're doing the thing like the New York Post last time.
Well, I would say that, and people like that, people making arguments like that, or even Mr. Norland's argument here. He said the wrong word. Like that's what this is about. It's like it's exponentially.
I think the distinction he's probably trying to make is between speech and action.
Fair enough. There's a little bit built in because he's been on Twitter, so. There's a context of Mr. Norland on Twitter when it came to this issue.
Well, no, that is. I mean, and in fact, what you're reading is a tweet. I just emailed it back to us. So that,
I didn't know that. Okay, fair enough.
Yes,
now I see that.
Those are
from you.
tweets that are then enclosed in an email.
Got it. Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Well, I mean, it's good discussion. I'm glad that I clarified. Knowing it's a tweet, though, I guess then the choppiness of his efficiency of words maybe is unfair to read into then.
Yes, I think that's a very fair statement with Twitter.
Yes, let's leave on that note. Okay, one more email. And by the way, if you want to send an email for a future episode of The Fix, the email is thefixmailbag@gmail.com. If you forget that, just go to pwtorchvip.com, and in the upper right corner, click Contact Us, or click the menu button if you're on our VIP site on your phone. Last mailbag question. Henrik from Denmark says, Wade and Todd, on a recent episode, you talked about Dolph Ziggler's name and how awful it is. This left me very confused. I love that. Perhaps it's because I'm not from the U.S., but I really don't see why there is anything bad about it. When I look at the WWE roster, I see names like Seth Rollins, Braun Strowman, Baron Corbin, and Sami Zayn. All names I find just as unusual as Dolph Ziggler. Could you explain exactly why the name is so bad?
Well, just as an aside, and granted, I mean, I don't want to. I want to be too harsh on our because I mean, different names from different places strike me as weird. Seth Rollins is, for Americans, a not an unusual name at all. It's a very generic sounding name, at least to me.
Yeah, I agree.
So I wouldn't put that in the category. But yeah, some of the other ones are I also think pretty wacky. Baron Corbin, the first time I heard it, sounded pretty silly. And the Sami Zayn. Less silly, but
if it was
also
spelled differently, if it was SAMMYZANE, that feels a little more normal. I think it's the 4-letter words that accentuate it a little bit.
Yeah. Then what was the other one there?
Braun Strowman.
Braun Strowman. Yeah, that's also sort of an unusual name.
Yeah.
So I think they're all part of the same pattern, which I think I wouldn't say that you need to distinguish Dolph Ziggler as the one bad WWE name, because I think in fact there are a lot of bad WWE names, and there's sort of a spectrum. The reason why Dolph Ziggler I think probably stands out the worst for me is that both parts of the name I associate principally with very silly things. The only Dolph that I know, I think, is Dolph Lundgren, who's sort of a goofy character, as sort of an 80s action hero type. And so when I hear the name, I just think fake, because who else, it sounds like you're obviously taking it off Dolph Lundgren. And then Ziggler, the only name that I ever heard that sounds like that is Dirk Diggler from Boogie Nights. So it sounds like you took like a wacky name from the guy from Rocky IV and a wacky name from Boogie Nights, and you threw them together to create this wacky name that every time I hear it just sounds completely and utterly fake. So I do think that there's a spectrum of bad names, but I stand by Dolph Ziggler being just the dirt worst for sounding comically ridiculous and just completely fake every time you hear it.
Yeah, and in his words on it, in an interview he did back, I think it was 2012, he said it was a little bit of a combination of the boss and myself trying to think of something that stuck, that would stand out and be totally different. And I could make my own waves with it, getting away from the Spirit Squad and getting away from being a caddy. Something totally different, and now I can make my own waves in this business. So I think we talked about it last time, that it wasn't like he was against it or saddled with it. He made it sound like it was an effort, a collective effort. There is a Zig Ziglar. His real name is Hillary Hinton Zig Ziglar, who was an American author, salesman, and motivational speaker who died a few years ago. I don't know how well known he was, but he's got his own like Wikipedia listing. So I don't know that Dolph was basing it on that, but Zig Ziglar with a different spelling is somebody else who's a celebrity.
I feel pretty confident that's not where the name came from, but who knows?
He wrote a lot of books in the 90s and 2000s, so he's kind of I don't know. But anyway, I'm with you too. I don't think it is, but in terms of sounding weird, I think it probably too is somewhat cultural, in that it's you kind of have to be immersed, and that's why he's saying that left me very confused, because just culturally, yeah, your associations with the name are similar to mine, Todd, in that it feels like more like when I think of Baron Corbin, does it seem like it's a combination of two other things to you? Or
no.
Yeah. So part of it, I think, and same with Seth Rollins and Braun Strowman or Sami Zayn for that matter, they're just names. With Dolph Ziggler, you're like, why would you grab two celebrity, parts of two celebrity names that just together kind of emote a certain feeling that doesn't feel main event. It just, I don't know. Yeah, it felt kind of cheesy, I guess. But
yes, yeah. Definitely cheesy.
All right. Well, let's Kevin Randleman. Super sad news. 44-year-old former high-profile MMA fighter in UFC and Pride, dying last week. Todd, your comments and thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just sad. I mean, because he's he was so young, and he'd had really sort of a rough time of it in recent years with like a lot of health issues. And he was a guy that had so much vitality in life. He was sort of a big personality and big athleticism. He sort of really stood out in the way he presented himself. It's also, I mean, it's I mean, you can't discuss his career without. I suppose you can, but it would be silly to discuss his career without acknowledging that ultimately it was a pretty disappointing one. He was a guy that was thought to be due for very big things from early in his career. I mean, he was an exemplary top of the line wrestler with really good athleticism, and he came in with Mark Coleman, and they were both expecting to be really dominant forces in the sport. And while they had their moments, and Coleman was the UFC heavyweight champion, he was a guy that he dropped too many fights that he should have won. He didn't. The Coleman and Randleman were these like wrestlers who were just crazy men, and rather than at a time period where people were sort of learning different aspects of the game, they just sort of went in there and they just sort of wrestled with each other and, had these wild training sessions where they were, beating each other up and getting tough, but they weren't learning a lot of the techniques that were important in the sport. And Coleman was consistently getting submitted. Randleman was also getting submitted a lot. He would frequently get into striking battles with guys who were better strikers than him. And he dropped a lot of fights that he shouldn't have lost. And ultimately his career really didn't go as far as it probably should have.
How did his wrestling compare coming into Brock Lesnar?
Better.
Yeah.
They were both NCAA champions. Lesnar once, Randleman twice. Yeah. Randleman also finished second a third time, and he would have had a chance to win in his fourth year because the 2 years that he won were sophomore and junior years, but he didn't come back for the senior year. So he was a higher caliber of wrestler than Brock Lesnar. And so much of Lesnar's success obviously was built on his freakish size. Randleman was, more of he fought a lot of his career at light heavyweight, so he was a smaller guy and used that technique more so than Brock Lesnar. So you could compare him to sort of a Kurt Angle type in that regard. And
Did Brock train more well-rounded and take it more seriously in that respect, or was it more the size and the timing of the opponents that made Brock's career, shorter, more successful?
Well, no, he was more. I wouldn't even say he was necessarily more successful. I mean, the timing of. I hadn't even thought of those two together. I actually think they're very similar. I don't think that Brock Lesnar took to a lot of aspects of MMA very well himself.
Yeah.
He never. I think the issue with Brock Lesnar, the difference between them, Randleman could strike. He was able to take a shot in the sense that he didn't panic. And he had success in striking. I mean, he famously knocked out Mirko Cro Cop, who was, the most feared striker of the day. And I mean, that was a shocking call. It was Mauro Ranallo's most famous call ever. As Wade just chuckles, thinking, "Can I do the impression?"
Oh no.
Mirko Cro Cop, Randleman has knocked down Mirko Cro Cop.
I was planning on that, Todd.
So. Yeah, so what was I saying? Oh, yeah. So, I mean, that was his Randleman's downfall was more that his submission defense wasn't very good and his strategy wasn't necessarily good. Lesnar just was not that well overall defined as an MMA fighter, but he had only fought for a short period of time. He had success early. Randleman had success early, and opponents figured both of them out. I think if Brock Lesnar had fought as many fights as Kevin Randleman did, I think he might have ended up with a fairly similar record to Kevin Randleman and a fairly similar sort of career trajectory, even though they were very different in terms of as fighters, in terms of the way that they fought. So I think there's something to that comparison point of guys that came in really well with really good at one discipline, but didn't necessarily develop all the aspects that you would want in a fighter.
How old was Kevin Randleman when he came in compared to Brock, too? Because I think age, Brock was seen as too old for the NFL. I don't know if it was courtesy comments, but his teammates on the Vikings who loved him during training camp just said, man, if he was 4 years younger, we'd totally keep him around and develop him.
I'm looking up. He's definitely younger.
Yeah.
How much younger? Let's see here. He was 25 when he had his first fight.
What was Brock, like 31?
Yeah, right around then.
Yeah, so... so that's a big enough difference where you could, I think with Brock too, obviously the diverticulitis just derailed whatever he was considering doing, as far as, getting serious about being well-rounded with MMA and really, diving in and having to round out his skills more. But, the age factor, I think, did...
That's also the case, by the way, for Randleman, though, who had some terrible staph infections and some surgeries, and he had a lot of health issues as well.
I guess from a timing standpoint, and it's even accelerated with CM Punk, there comes a point where you're like, there's just not time to I kind of have to be what I'm going to be. I don't know if Brock ever felt that way, but I think if Brock were, 8-9 years younger, he would have just said, oh, I got all the time in the world. And there comes a point where you're like, no, I just got to go and see what I can do in the big matches, and there's not going to be time for me to become the fighter I could have been had I started 10 years earlier. Randleman started young enough, minus health issues, maybe would have had more time to develop in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. I kind of derailed it on the Lesnar talk, and you were more on Coleman and Randleman. Anything else you want to say about that, or?
No, I mean, I'd hit most of the key points. I mean, he was a guy that just had. I mean, a lot of his memories, unfortunately, were not necessarily the most positive ones. In the sense that he famously failed the drug test in Nevada in Pride when he tried to submit what the authorities concluded was horse urine for his urine test, which is a funny task and. A funny tack, rather, to take, and that was after a fight with Mauricio Shogun Hua, which was the first Pride show in Las Vegas that I went to. That was just such a fun experience for to finally be able to see Pride live after having watched those shows from Japan for so many years. And unfortunately, it meant for Randleman that he would have to be subjected to drug testing again after having fought in sort of the Wild West of Pride before.
Yeah.
But the knockout of Cro Cop that I mentioned early, and then that was the highlight. But then he rematched Cro Cop, and Cro Cop submitted him with a guillotine in less than a minute, and that was really notable because that was the only time Cro Cop had ever submitted anyone with a submission hold, and it was years later before he got a second submission. There's a Fedor fight where he just did this incredible suplex of Fedor, where he just dropped Fedor right on his head, and that was one of the fights that really established Fedor as sort of a guy that people perceived to be like a cyborg, because he just walked right through it and he submitted Randleman just moments later. He had another fight that I remember very well against Kazushi Sakuraba, where Sakuraba was sort of on the downside of his career, and Randleman was just sort of holding down Sakuraba, and I remember being so angry. I was like, you're just holding down Sakuraba. And then Sakuraba finally got in this armbar at the very tail end of the fight and pulled off the win, which was very satisfying to me at the time.
I love where your voice goes when you're talking about a favorite. There's this whole other tone. Whole new inflection.
It's true. This is also, by the way, why I have like a terrible poker face, whether I'm happy about something or I'm sad about something. We've never met, but you can sort of get it from talking with me. Like, I do the same thing in life, and it's a bad thing because, like, if I'm reacting negatively to something, like, people know immediately, even if I don't want them to. Or if I'm happy about something, it's very obvious, even if I'm trying to cover it up. But his loss to Quentin Jackson was one of the key fights that got Quentin Jackson up to a different level. When Quentin Jackson was a guy that was rising up the Pride cards, and I remember at the time a lot of people, including myself, thought that Randleman was too much for Quentin at that point in time. But Quentin knocked him out, and that was a big catalyst for him. So yeah, I mean, a lot of memories of him over the years. Famously the show, the only UFC show where they had to cancel the main event the night of because Kevin Randleman slipped backstage and hit his head on a pipe, and that was it for the main event. And the weakest UFC card of all time, I think it was UFC 25, if I remember correctly. There was just a complete disaster area because of that. So not UFC 25. In fact, I just went to look it up. UFC 24. What a stupid mistake, Wade.
It's just awful. You're going to be fine.
How dare me?
I'll have to be talked out of firing you later. How did Kevin Randleman die? I don't think we talked about that. I mean, he's a young guy.
It was pneumonia and something else at the same time. I think there was a heart issue at the same time. I'm not sure what was the catalyst of
Is there a thought that drugs or MMA contributed in any way? Is that being talked about or confirmed or dismissed?
I haven't heard any discussion along those lines. No,
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I didn't know of him. Heart failure after being admitted to the hospital with pneumonia. So, yeah, it sounds like the pneumonia was weakening his system, and then that led to heart failure.
That's scary. I mean, yeah. Okay, let's talk about Bellator and UFC coming up this weekend.
Yes, this is quite the Bellator card. As I tweeted this out, but they've got Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock, who are two of the most famous fighters of all time, and they're fighting tonight. When they fight on Friday, they will be collectively, I think, I'm forgetting whether this is the exact number, but I think 14 years older collectively than Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper were when they had Age in the Cage. So two very old men.
Next thing you're going to tell me is Kimbo's fighting on this card too.
and Kimbo is completely is going to completely outclass his opponent, which tells you all you need to know about that fight. I haven't seen it yet, but like everyone was talking about his opponent, Dada 5000. It was originally going to be Dada 6000.
That's not his name. Be serious.
It was they were originally gonna hire Dada 6000, but they ran out of money in the last minute, so they had to go for the older model. But apparently, people were talking about like his open workout was just like a complete embarrassment. Like people were just like he couldn't seem to effectively, like just warm up. Throwing his hands in the gloves of the guy holding him up. So this guy.
But is he coming armed with a sledgehammer? Because that could be an equalizer, Todd. That could be an equalizer.
That's been the ads of him carrying a sledgehammer. So we'll see if he brings it into the cage.
I just made that up. No, I'm kidding. All right.
So yeah, I mean that's Bellator. You got Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie and Kimbo Slice versus Dada 5000.
Now, does Royce need the money? Is there literally anything in a sports competitive way that is at stake here in any kind of relevant historical way?
I mean, no, there's no relevance to answer that question.
I mean, how long ago was the Matt Hughes fight?
That would have been 2006, I think. Yeah. I was at that one.
We're 10 years past Royce being this grandfather helping put over Matt Hughes. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah, as far as his motivation, I think it's probably a combination of things. I mean, obviously money helps. I mean, he's actually being the IRS is after him right now because of his supposed non-reporting of income that he earned overseas. And I don't know what his financial situation is, but given that there's a big tax bill due, that probably played a role. And also, Royce is always a guy that has sought out opponents. He's targeted opponents. So like he looks for fights at points where he thinks he can win. Like, and I think part of the mentality was he saw Ken Shamrock in his last fight against Kimbo, where Kimbo beat Ken Shamrock, and Royce thought this guy is ripe for the picking. He's old, he's fragile, he doesn't have any cardio, and for years Ken Shamrock always wanted another fight with Royce Gracie because they'd fought twice, and the first time was a win by Royce Gracie, and the second time was technically a draw, although people tend to think Ken Shamrock did better, and so Ken wanted to sort of prove it with judges, and Royce had sort of avoided the fight for a number of years, and I think Royce is thinking, well, now may be the time because Ken is sort of at the end of his rope, and I've at least kept myself in good physical shape. So I think it's a combination of that and the money.
Should Bellator be headlining with this, or should they use Shamrock and Gracie as that special attraction co-headline because it'll have some eyeballs from people who are longer-term fans out of curiosity tuning in?
And then you bring them in for the youngster Kimbo. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. I in general am of that mentality that if you're going to use sort of a special attraction, you put them second from the top, and then you have your current guys in the main event. Even if that's not how it's presented in advance, you sort of make them feel important because you're getting the rub from them if you're going to do that sort of fight. And I think that's the mentality in general, but that's not what Bellator is doing here. This Bellator card You've got the 2 freak show fights at the top, and then you've got 3 random generic fights underneath. It's not by any means a showcase of their best fighters apart from the top 2 fights.
Yeah, it seems like a loss. If they want to be, if it's not just a one-off, put a couple other faces on that poster. I mean, you don't want to crowd the poster too much, but I think you can still say Kimbo's on the show as a third item, but give some name recognition to one of your, whoever your most attractive in his prime serious fighters is. So it seems like a lost opportunity. Pro Wrestling Connection, Kurt Angle is at FanFest tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow in Houston from 8 to 11, along with Tito Ortiz and a couple others, right, Todd?
Yes, and another Pro Wrestling Connection, Ken Shamrock was in the WWF. There you go, Pro Wrestling Connection.
Well,
boom.
There's an implication I didn't know that. I don't know.
I wasn't really implying anything. I really don't even know where I was going with that.
I don't either. We'll just move on.
No, but one other thing though,
okay.
What you're saying about the card, that is an argument for putting that sort of fight on the card.
Yeah.
They did not put that sort of fight on the card, so there's nothing they would put above those 2 based on the other fights on this card. I mean, you could put Emmanuel Newton, Lynn Vassell in the advertising, but given that they're not going to be important players for you going forward, they're just sort of generic light heavyweights, in my opinion. At the point you have this card, there's really no point in advertising the other ones.
Will they at least advertise, like, on the show, Benson Henderson at the building or in the crowd, or try to promote? I mean, hopefully they'll... I'm just trying to think of, like, some purpose other than a one-off for trying to bring some fans to the Bellator brand on a Friday night, besides a one-off TV rating and gate. You want to do something to build the brand for the future. That doesn't just make them seem like they're a freak show.
Yeah, I mean, as far as building the brand as just something other than freak show fights, I mean, they haven't been doing a great job of that.
Yeah.
They have, and I do think that they'll advertise some other stuff on the card. That's always been something Scott Coker will do. So I think they'll probably have the announcement of Benson Henderson's first Bellator. Well, I mean, they've already made the announcement. I think they'll showcase that on the card. They'll probably talk about the Josh Koscheck fight against Paul Daly they've been building up. I thought that they'd advertise another special announcement. I've been thinking they might advertise the signing of Vanderlei Silva, but given that he was suspended for 3 years today, that's a negative.
Well,
but who knows? They could run a show in a non-commission area. I mean, that sounds like something they'd do.
That always goes over well with the commissions here. All right, UFC. Let's move to Sunday night. Fight.
Yeah, not a lot to talk about here because unfortunately a lot of the fights on the card have been canceled over the last few days. Some of the more fun fights, including John Lineker getting Dungay fever. So shout out to John Lineker. Stay strong. Dungay fever almost killed me off when I was a kid. So.
Ooh.
I'm always sympathetic to that. Not the fever, people who get it.
Yeah, I got that.
An important clarification.
You surprise me every once in a while, but I don't know that I would think you would be giving a shout out to a fever.
Shout out to the Dungay. It may be stronger. So yeah, I mean the main event is Cowboy Cerrone in his welterweight I think debut. But I'm not sure about that. He might have fought that earlier in his career. Certainly he's not fought at welterweight in a very long period of time against another Cowboy, Alex Oliveira. So we'll see how Cowboy does, the Cowboy Cerrone does at welterweight at 170, particularly after coming off that, pretty emphatic loss to Rafael Dos Anjos.
Do you like him at 170?
I think he can compete at 170. I mean, he was always a long guy at 155, so I think if he bulks up a little bit in terms of his thickness, I think he would fit it right in at 170. I mean, 170 is full of really, really good fighters, though. So I mean, I think there's only sort of a limit to how far he can go given the strength of the division, but. I think he can do well there. So yeah, that's the main event, and then in the co-main event, Juan Carnero and Derek Brunson, which is just sort of a fight. UFC really likes Juan Carnero. He had sort of fallen out of the division, out of the promotion rather, years back with a submission loss to Kevin Burns, which was notable at the time because he was this. Carnero was this really highly regarded, multiple degree black belt, and he got submitted by a guy with not those credentials at all that really stood out. And then he just sort of fought generically, but then at random places and wasn't doing particularly well. But then he won the one night tournament that Jim Ross called, and at Battlegrounds. And since then, UFC brought him back, and they gave him his first fight against Mark Munoz, which was a very high-profile fight against a star guy in Mark Munoz, and now he's in a co-main event with Derek Brunson. So they clearly see something in the guy. And I guess the other higher profile fight is Dennis Bermudez against Tatsuya Kawajiri. Bermudez, one of the better guys in his division. So, and he tends to be an action fighter. Kawajiri was a Pride star and a star in Japan in general for a number of years. But he's getting up there in age, so I think Bermudez is going to be too much for him. But we'll see. Yeah, and those are sort of the top fights.
All right, very good. I don't think I've got anything else. Anything else you want to touch on?
No, I'm gonna lose my voice. So
yeah, okay, sounds good. Long show. I didn't think we'd go this long, but
I didn't either. I thought this was going to be a short show. I don't know what happened. What can you do?
Yeah.
Hopefully people enjoy.
I hope so too. And we've got somebody on Twitter waiting to do his workout tonight till we get the show up. So let me get to editing and posting so we can get to his exercise.
Yeah, we have not been helpful in that regard.
No, we have not.
I blame you.
That's fine. I'm the one that has to deal with the editing and posting, so I'll take full blame.
Yes, good.
Yes, but don't show me up like that in public again. Thanks, Todd.
All right, have a good night, mate.
This is PWTorch.com editor Wade Keller along with Todd Martin, and this is The Fix with Todd Martin here at PW Torch VIP, recorded Wednesday, February 24th, 2016. Todd, there's just a ridiculous amount of things to talk about. I don't know how we're going to get through it. We'll start with Shane McMahon. I think we kind of have to. I'm interested in your take on what we saw Monday night.
Yeah, a lot of just in that simple question. There's a lot to unpack. I always liked Shane. I am one of those people. I understand your points about him having advantages that other people didn't have, but I like Shane because one, he tended to have entertaining matches in spite of those shortcuts. Well, not in spite of those shortcuts, with those shortcuts. Two, he always seemed to enjoy wrestling, and I appreciated that in a family that's very much seems about like defining WWE was very important to them. And Shane wasn't shy about saying that he liked other stuff, his interest in ECW, his interest in UFC. He seemed more relatable than sort of the McMahon cult. And in those matches and those feuds, while we've seen with the other McMahons so often it's about putting themselves over, Shane, almost without exception, would end every feud with him getting destroyed by whoever it was. So he was genuinely putting people over at the end of pretty much every feud, whether he was a face or whether he was a heel. And some of the criticism about him doing a lot of spots and sort of being made to look good, I think misses the point that in the context of the stories they were telling, he pretty much always was putting over the other guys that were in there. So I like Shane. I was happy to see him get the response that he did. As far as where they go from here, I mean, it's a very interesting question. Where he fits into the family, how the family is thinking about him, what he wants to be doing, and in terms of the build for WrestleMania and the WrestleMania matches, there's a lot of different angles, and I think we'll learn more as it goes along as to what's going on. I mean, obviously there is the psychological component of what exactly they're going to be doing with Shane and The Undertaker, and the fact that there's sort of split motivations. And I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with a babyface versus babyface match, in that I think you can frequently have that be, and it has, throughout history, there have been big babyface versus babyface matches. But I think the key is you have to have people really get behind their guy. And the thing with Shane versus Undertaker, at least as it stands right now, and later on, I'm going to drop the bomb on you. I'm going to explain how the whole thing works out. It's going to you may have to hold on to things. Your mind may explode. But in terms of like the way it's presented right now, you've got the people very much want the authority to be gone, and on one hand, and on the other hand, they very much like the Undertaker. So it's very difficult to get them to root against the Undertaker, and it's very difficult for them to want to root for the authority to continue. So there's very much divided loyalties there, and there's sort of a similar dynamic with Dean Ambrose and Brock Lesnar, because the basic dynamic there is that Dean Ambrose is being presented as this gutsy guy that keeps coming in spite of taking beatings, and he's sort of sympathetic for continuing to come. Which could work in some settings, but the problem here is that Brock Lesnar's whole deal is people enjoy him just gratuitously destroying people. So the idea of being able to build up sympathy for Dean Ambrose is very difficult when on the other side you've got this guy where the whole shtick is enjoying him watching destroy people. It doesn't really fit together. And then the other top match, you've got the Triple H versus Roman Reigns dynamic, where obviously the fans are with the guy who's supposed to be the heel much more than the guy who's supposed to be the face. Although I think that one's the easiest remedy, because at this point, and I'm jumping all over the place. At this point, I think it's pretty clear we're going to get a double turn at WrestleMania, and we've discussed throughout this whole period of the idea of Roman Reigns turning heel, and I've mentioned with you, I'm like, he's not going to turn heel, so there's really not that much of a point of speculating these various points. I didn't think he was turning heel at Fastlane or at the Royal Rumble or TLC. I thought there was an outside chance at Survivor Series, but I didn't think they would. WrestleMania, I think they're going to do it. I think at this point, for a number of reasons. One is they're sort of reaching a critical mass where the fans are getting more and more vocal against Roman Reigns, and you could really see that on Monday night. And I think at this point, it's pretty darn clear that this is unsustainable. And two, WrestleMania is the perfect break point where they time it out. The big turn comes at WrestleMania, and then afterwards you can segue into the new programs with Roman Reigns being in this new position. Whereas if you did it before WrestleMania at some point, it would break up the story that they've been telling. Post WrestleMania, they're telling a new story. That's the time. If you wanted to, well, the time was really like 6 months ago, but if you need like a time within the period of, say, Royal Rumble to SummerSlam, the time to do it is WrestleMania, because that's a natural break point when you can then build for what's coming afterwards. There's so many more faces than heels at this point. I don't think that's an accident. I think they would be turning more people if if they thought that if they were setting up Roman Reigns for post WrestleMania a post WrestleMania babyface run, they'd be setting up those heels. They're not setting up those heels right now. I think that's a clue. And then the biggest clue to me was the booking of the show on Monday night, where Triple H was pretty much an overt face. He didn't appear at the beginning with Vince and Stephanie, the heels. He was beating Roman Reigns straight up. And then the real copper was at the end, after he's laid out Roman Reigns. The people are cheering for him, rooting for him. And granted, the people that are going against this are saying Triple H at times does look, to sort of his own ego. But I think at this point, it was so obvious at this point that if you're trying to keep Roman Reigns a babyface, you can't be doing stuff to make him look bad. And he cocks his fist and he does the crotch chop. And to me, that was, I as much as Triple H sometimes can get full of himself in terms of these angles, I don't think Triple H does that if he doesn't know the direction of this thing is a double turn. So I think at WrestleMania that's what we're getting.
Well, and I think when you put it that way, it raises the stakes, because if there isn't a double turn, you look back at February 22nd and you say, WTF. I mean, Triple H gets to criticize nobody ever again for doing something self-indulgent that completely undercuts the main goal that the promotion has in an angle or a match.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, and look, as I said, Triple H is a guy that's been selfish in the past, but he's also a smart guy, and he does it in subtle ways that you can justify it as you're going along. And I don't think there's anybody watching who knows anything about wrestling that would watch what Triple H did at the end of the show and not say that guy is undermining what they're trying to do with Roman Reigns if he is, if Roman Reigns is supposed to be the babyface in this. Because the cross chop was one thing, the cocking the fist. Yeah, the cocking the fist was mocking the guy after you've beaten him up even, and the people are cheering you for it. Like, that was like an F you, look at me, buddy. Like that sort of thing. Like, every instinct of a guy who knows the business is not going to do that if you know this guy needs all the help he can get at that point in time. Along with the factors I just said, the fact that you're reaching a critical mass and WrestleMania is a natural breakpoint. Oh, and I'll bring up one other thing, is that it's the same thing with Daniel Bryan a few years ago. WrestleMania is a big show. So they screwed up with Daniel Bryan, and they said, okay, we'll do it at WrestleMania, we'll put Daniel Bryan over, and then we'll tell the story that, oh, this is our plan all along, because look what we did at WrestleMania. We put Daniel Bryan over Triple H, we put him over Randy Orton and Batista. This was our master plan. And they could do the exact same thing here, where they build to WrestleMania, they do a big angle where Roman Reigns finally turns heel, the people will hate him, you set up the post-WrestleMania feud, and then you say, what were you stupid internet fans? We took you in hook, line, and sinker. We got you to dislike this guy so much. We were just working you the whole time, and now we pulled the trigger, and look how mad you are. We're the master manipulators, and we planned this whole brilliant thing out ages ago.
Okay, well, that takes care of my first question. Actually, and 2 through 8, I think also. So do you want to go to is Shane gonna wrestle Undertaker one-on-one, or do you think that Undertaker shows up Monday and does the only thing that Undertaker can do to save the integrity of his character, which is say, no, Vince, you don't tell me who to wrestle. I'm not Big Show. I'm not desperate for money. I'm not a sap who's just looking to do what you tell me and for your approval. I'm the Phenom. In so many words, Undertaker style. Isn't that what he has to say?
Well, I answer your first question first. I think that they are going to do. No, because I got a longer answer for the second one. So Shane and Undertaker, I do think they're going to do the match for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, that's just what I hear. I mean, Dave Meltzer was reporting that it was going to be someone outside the company weeks ago, and he didn't know who it was going to be, but it was someone outside the box, and they knew back then whoever this was going to be. And if it's not Shane McMahon in this scenario, who exactly is it going to be at this point? I also was talking with someone that knows Shane McMahon. He was saying that Shane was talking like this was the deal. And granted, he could be swerving, but he seems to be committed to the idea of doing this match. So the other thing in terms of why I think it's going to be this is that if they don't do, WWE's in the habit, they will sometimes tease something and then go with something else. But the key to the whole thing is they always have to feel like the thing that they're substituting it for is bigger than the original. And I don't see what they can do that will feel bigger than the original. And that's the sort of the problem you've been having in sort of your own sort of bargaining is like, well, it makes more sense to do Bray Wyatt or Ryback or whoever it is. But regardless of whether you think that's a better idea in theory, clearly, if you do that after having teased Shane versus The Undertaker, it's going to be grossly unsatisfying to the audience, and it's going to make WrestleMania feel like less of a big deal. So they need something that's bigger, and I don't know exactly what they're going to do that's bigger. The other thing about it, and this is less an affirmative point, but sort of a counter argument to the arguments that are remaining against it, which is one of the arguments you made is how do you sell this thing in terms of the idea of Shane being a competition for The Undertaker. And we've seen this and the question here is whether they're going to do it, not whether they should do it. We've seen this plenty of times in the past with them booking the McMahons in big matches. You know, Vince McMahon wrestled Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. Vince McMahon wrestled Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania when he was 60 years old. If Vince McMahon can wrestle Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania when he is 60 years old, Shane McMahon can wrestle the 50-year-old Undertaker at 46 without it in any way diverging from past precedent or the way WWE looks at things. But as far as your second question, which is essentially how do you you sell this thing and make...
Can I interject?
Sure.
Can we agree, though, doing something absurd and stupid and narrative-breaking as a precedent doesn't exclude it from being criticized when they go back to it later?
Could you reframe the question? I didn't fully get where you went with that.
If you do something, if you set a precedent and survive doing something completely stupid and and destructive to the narrative or damaging to the narrative structure of...
Yeah, destructive is probably overstating the point, but yeah.
Yes, well, yeah. We can argue that. I think they have to work a lot harder to do basic things these days because of stuff like that. I think they pay the price every week for it. But narrative damaging, structurally damaging. If they did it in the past, sometimes I hear people go, well, this was done before, so that makes it okay. And I just don't think that, or the other argument that often comes up is, well, they've never done it right. They've never done it right in this circumstance before, so why even bring up what the right thing is to do?
Yeah, that's why I made the point to say that the discussion we are having is whether they will do it.
Yes.
That was specifically why I said that, because that is an explanation of why we should expect them to do that. That's a separate issue from whether they should do that sort of thing.
Yep. Good.
As far as your other question, which is how you...
By the way, Todd, I'm going to interrupt you again. I'd like to thank you not only for answering my question, but making it clear that you made it clear earlier and I should have understood.
No. That really wasn't a criticism of you. I was just... I wanted you to know that I was thinking about that issue before that, and I was trying to flag that.
And thank you for not owning being a jerk. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Look at these passive-aggressive shots.
That is not passive-aggressive. That's actually pretty in your face, but I am totally kidding. Go ahead. It's more just trying to make you uncomfortable, or more so the listeners uncomfortable. Is he serious? What's going on here? All right, go ahead. I'm done. That's it. Todd, I think you hit mute. Or you quit. There you are.
Sorry, yeah, I did accidentally hit the button on my little headset here. Sorry about that.
That's fine. You and Bruce are even this week. Bruce did that at the start of the round table.
It was waving about. Usually, if I'm muted, I'll do it on my computer. But here, I just accidentally hit the button as I was moving the thing out of my way.
Gotcha.
So get ready here. You want me to tie everything together, and I am going to. I'm ready here to tie everything together. I will make everything make sense, and I will put everyone in their proper place. You ready for this?
I am. I'm so ready.
Get excited. This is good, people. I really should be getting paid for this scenario, but I'll give it away here for free to the listeners. So one other issue just to start with here is that you need something. They've announced that The Rock is going to be involved in some way, in an important way at WrestleMania. And that raises the question of what exactly you're going to do, because the question for so long, the idea I think originally was that Rock was going to be the special ref for Triple H versus Roman Reigns, and then raise Roman Reigns' hand at the end. But as I mentioned earlier, I think at this point they're doing the double turn. I think they've given up the idea of Roman Reigns being the babyface going forward. I think they're going to go through WrestleMania and then they're going to go with him as a heel. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but I really think that's what they're going to do at this point. I just think it's so clear in terms of it being the right thing and the things I mentioned earlier. So you need Rock somewhere in there. And I'm still going to put him in that original role. So you announce Rock as the referee for WrestleMania, and you make it a no DQ match. So, okay, let's start earlier in the card. You have Shane McMahon, and we're just going to go over the top two matches and how you tie everything together. Shane McMahon starts the match against Undertaker by running away from the Undertaker. He's running around the ring. He's doing it's they did this with X-Pac back in the day, where Shane McMahon was always trying to escape from X-Pac, and the announcers sort of telling the story. Oh, why is Shane trying to avoid the thing? But you're fitting into the thing. Why is Shane McMahon getting into a match with the Undertaker? And we really shouldn't have Shane McMahon being presented as an equal to the Undertaker, given. You're basically your quibble with that we shouldn't have Shane McMahon being presented as a non-wrestler as being an equal to the Undertaker. So Shane McMahon is running, trying to escape the Undertaker. He eventually gets bolt cutters and he escapes the cage. Taker chases him down, at which point Roman Reigns comes out and he attacks the Undertaker. That's his heel turn. Vince McMahon comes out, he tries to stop it, and they lay out Vince. At that point, they bring Taker back into Hell in the Cell. They lock the cell, and the Undertaker versus Shane McMahon match at WrestleMania in Hell in a Cell is effectively a handicap match with a babyface Undertaker against a heel Shane McMahon and Roman Reigns. You have them fighting, Taker's fighting them both off. They eventually overwhelm him. Shane eventually beats Undertaker, but it's clearly because of Roman Reigns. So you don't have the issue of Shane being portrayed as a physical equal to Undertaker. You don't have the problem of fans with divided loyalties in the Shane McMahon versus Undertaker match, because they're clearly going to side with Undertaker at the point that Shane McMahon is siding with Roman Reigns, trying to double team Undertaker. That's not going to be an issue there, in spite of the fans liking Shane on Monday. I think a lot of that was the fact they haven't seen him in a while. I don't think it's very hard to make him a heel at this point in time. And you don't have the problem of fans with divided loyalties going into the main event. At this point, you've clearly established that the heel-face dynamic for the main event as well. Roman Reigns is going to be the heel going against Triple H. So in the main event, you got Shane and Reigns. They keep trying to cheat Triple H. He's fighting them off valiantly. Rock's giving him dirty looks, but Reigns is saying, hey, we're family. Finally, Rock's had enough. He knocks Shane off the apron, and at that point, after Rock has intervened with Shane, that's when Reigns jumps Rock from behind, lays out Rock, spears Triple H, gets the win with the second RAF. So now you've set up Reigns as super hot heel. He's got the future programs with The Rock and The Undertaker. Plus, you've got Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, AJ Styles lined up in the interim. WWE gets to act like the Roman Reigns turn was this brilliant plan all along, just like Daniel Bryan. Then the next night, here we tie everything together. Shane explains that the reason they accepted Vince McMahon's bargain sight unseen was because he knew he had the trump card in Roman Reigns. Reigns then explains he was sick of these fans giving him this shit for all year and a half, but he damn sure wasn't going to join Triple H and Stephanie McMahon after they've been making his life a miserable hell. So he called up Shane McMahon, and they hatched up their master plan to take control of Raw and to make Roman Reigns the face of the promotion as a heel. At that point, Undertaker comes out. Undertaker explains that he accepted that match with Shane because he saw through Shane, and he always knew that Shane was a snake in the grass, going back years and years and years, and he challenges Roman Reigns to a match at next year's WrestleMania, saying he's going to get his revenge, and if I don't beat you at next year's WrestleMania, I'll retire. So you got your big match for WrestleMania next year, Undertaker versus Roman Reigns, with Roman Reigns with Undertaker retiring if he doesn't beat Roman Reigns, and then Vince later comes out, and as a babyface, he gives Triple H the control of SmackDown, the other promotion that Shane doesn't have control over. Vince leaves. Stephanie makes it clear she's with Hunter, but she stops becoming in front of the camera so she can do the stuff in the charity work as a babyface without it contradicting her on-face character. And then you create the different identity for SmackDown with Triple H as the babyface leader and using some of the NXT talent and the NXT identity. There you go. Boom.
Boom. What percentage of that do you think is realistic?
It's all doable.
No. Doable.
What's undoable
100%.
in terms of no. In terms of WWE's motivations,
Yeah.
you've still got your heel authority figures that they love to do, and I think you're better off with a babyface authority figure, frankly, or no authority figure at all, and you just do something. The guy behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz. You still got your heel authority figure. You're putting over Roman Reigns, huge. You've set up the big match for WrestleMania next year.
Yeah.
You got Triple H as your big babyface figure that they want to do, and the guy that's sort of in charge of something different.
Yep.
You give SmackDown an identity that they want. You put everyone in their proper role, and everything they've just said to this point makes sense.
So no, and I'm not disagreeing that it makes sense. My question is, do you?
What about his against their agenda though?
That's what I'm. But I'm not. You're reading into my question as anything but just having you kind of affirm, either affirm that they're the geniuses that you are, or that, or no, and or that you think, well, no, it's a good scenario. It's what they should do. All the cards are in place. It fits their agenda. But I don't think there's a chance in hell that they're thinking along these lines. And I'm just not sure where you are on the line between those two extremes.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. I laid out a lot of details to think that they're going to do exactly what I just said.
Yeah.
But as far as a lot of the sort of the larger narrative that I'm telling, I think a lot of it could very well be directions that they're going. Particularly the idea that the Shane McMahon being a heel in this whole thing. I think the people, because of how positively people reacted to Shane on Monday, I think people are thinking, triumphant Shane, we love Shane. But if you look at the way they set it up, if he hadn't gotten such a big reaction, I think people would be going, you got Shane against The Undertaker. What exactly are they, how exactly are they trying to tell this story? And Shane McMahon being a bad player in this, so to speak, fits a lot better with him being in a match with The Undertaker than anything else. And it's true they could also just be doing sort of the car crash. You're matching up two people that have names, but WWE does typically like to have some sort of larger narrative, and it's difficult to tell that narrative without Undertaker's clearly not going to be a heel. I mean, it's just, well, I shouldn't say clearly, but I would be very surprised if they tried to tell the story that Undertaker is a heel in Texas against Shane McMahon. I think that's going to be difficult to pull off. Whereas Shane being the one who's not necessarily an all positive actor is much more easy to pull off.
Yes. All right. Yeah. I mean, I am critical of where this is the thing. My criticism is multi-layered because I'm not a fan of Shane McMahon as a wrestler. I'm not a fan of the narrative of the McMahons play by a different set of rules. I don't like justifying it. I like criticizing it because I don't think just because a precedent is set for doing something totally egotistical and narrative distracting, damaging, or even destroying to a certain degree. And destroying is a strong word. I agree with you, Todd. That we just go, okay, well that's the way they work. So let's just all nod along to the mighty McMahons and their brilliance. So. That said, so on principle, I'm kind of against anything that involves the presentation being that it's totally reasonable that Shane would be okay with it. But you cover it. So my criticism does go away, and in retrospect, is ill-founded. Or ill-founded is not the right word, but I have to back off from it. If everything gets explained, and that meticulous attention to detail was there starting on Monday night, Shane giving in despite apparently having the power to not have to put his power on the line. There's an explanation in retrospect for Vince falling into the web, or the web is to get Undertaker, and if they have to explain why Undertaker is even accepting. Did you cover that? Why Undertaker?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. What was that again? Because there was a lot in there.
Because he knew that Shane was a snake in the grass from the beginning. He doesn't trust Shane McMahon.
Yep.
He doesn't like the idea of Shane McMahon taking control.
So the babyface is the smartest guy in the room, which is what you want.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if they can have that all play out in the end, and we look back and go, wow, every step of the way, they knew what they were doing, then it works really well.
They don't have a great history of doing this, but I'm just saying it's. I'm still.
I love it. Yep.
It's doable. The situation is doable.
What I like about you, a lot I like about what you laid out, because I think it does put them in a good place, and it does. You didn't just dream book a scenario that would be, quote, fun to watch, you took into account what's truly best for business and what their normal motivations are, what usually drives what they do. And so you weren't it's not like you booked Triple H to lose 3 straight falls to somebody in a best of 5 falls match, which is never going to happen, and it's just not realistic.
We're bringing up Sami Zayn, and we're going all the way.
Yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. So you covered that, and so I like that is all covered. But what I also like about it on a different level is it sets the bar so high for the level of attention to detail that WWE should be incorporating into their show in the way that people appreciate, Breaking Bad doing so, or in the high standard that they hold TV shows or Fargo or whatever,
or the way Bill Watts would. It doesn't necessarily have to be television.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Or how about this one? Or the way that Pat Patterson would when he was the head booker for Vince McMahon.
Yep. So let's see. We'll see on the checklist how well they do in the next month and a half in this regard. Yeah. Anything else from Raw? I mean, that obviously we hit the big topics. I kind of want to make sure we hit anything else from Raw before we move on. A number of things on the show, relatively small things like Charlotte announcing Becky and Sasha fighting each other for a shot at her, the forwarding of the Jericho Styles situation, and anything else. I know you covered kind of the big 3 already.
I really like the Dean Ambrose Brock Lesnar angle, particularly the one at the beginning of the show.
Yeah.
I thought that was a nice, violent angle, and it sort of added a sort of a seriousness to the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of the stuff with Dean Ambrose has been a little bit too wink, like the way that he showed up at the end. But I really like Brock Lesnar's really angry and he's attacking Dean Ambrose in a parking lot. Like that's sort of stuff. That's what I like about pro wrestling.
Yes.
Angry people beating up other people in parking lots. Not people telling jokes in the ring. I guess it sort of it speaks to my outlook. But I was watching on the bus on the way home the press conference between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, which we talked about earlier, which was just them basically swearing at each other for long periods of time, and I enjoy that sort of thing. So I like that angle, and we had the discussion earlier a few weeks ago about Paul Heyman and about the idea that some of his material wasn't as good heading into Fastlane when you didn't. And my sort of defense of it was that he was trying to sell a match that wasn't going to take place. Monday night, he's trying to sell that Dean Ambrose versus Brock Lesnar match, and I thought it was his best performance in quite a while. He gave a really good promo, I thought, in building up Brock Lesnar as this destroyer is coming after Dean Ambrose. So I thought that was very good as well.
Yep. Anything else from Raw?
No.
Okay. I know you mentioned just kind of a response to Fastlane. Anything in addition to what happened at Raw that you want to cover as far as that goes?
Yeah, I meant in terms of the fan reaction to Fastlane, because I
get it. Okay, yeah.
I thought it was very striking in that if you have a bad show and it gets bad reviews, you sort of expect that, right? Like, because it's a bad show. So the way you remedy that is by having better shows, and then you hope that you'll get better reviews. But I mean, I really thought that the show on Sunday was a good show. I mean, it wasn't a great show, but it was a good show.
Yeah.
The wrestling was good, and they didn't do a bunch of stupid stuff. But it had such negativity towards it. And I thought it was really reflective of the frustration with creative direction right now, where you can put on a show that for the most part in and of itself is actually pretty good, but people were so darn angry about the fact that Roman Reigns is challenging Triple H for the title at WrestleMania that they just, they hated the show because of that. And I thought it was sort of a warning sign for WWE in terms of their direction, that's how the fans were feeling.
I'm going to look up our poll response to see where things ended up in our poll. I'm just pulling it up now because I haven't looked at this for a couple days. Actually, that's the wrong poll. Here we go. Fastlane, 0 to 10. So what do you think I don't know if you looked at our poll response. What do you think the average?
I actually did, so I remember vaguely. It would be more a test of my memory than anything else.
Okay, no, but your analysis is right because it's 60% thumbs down. Yeah, 22% average and only 17% above average. And what's strange, Todd, people accuse, the media, they're so negative. We actually, in our roundtable reviews in the newsletter, were thumbs in the middle or thumbs up across the board, mostly thumbs up. So it is interesting that there's some shows where I think there's a singular issue that can drive people to dislike that overrides the good aspects of the show, or that and in this case, I think probably it's a finish with Roman Reigns drove a lot of people just completely bonkers.
Yep, I think that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, and it is. You're right. It's a test. It's WWE has a challenge on their hands, which is to win back the goodwill of their audience, and I think they might look at what happened with Shane McMahon as some sort of positive, but in a way, the response he got, I think, was a combination, and we've covered this to a degree, but a combination of love for Shane and a love for a break in the narrative of Stephanie and Vince spending a bunch of time saying wonderful things about each other, and Stephanie about to read an acceptance speech. I think there was a thought of, thank God that era's over. Maybe it's over. It was almost like the response Kevin Garnett got about a year ago when he got traded back to the Timberwolves. And I was in the building for that, and Garnett came out. It was as thunderous as it's been since Game 7 against Sacramento in the playoffs when he was on the team. It was just crazy. The place was rocking, and it was kind of symbolic of, oh, God, thank God that nightmare of Kurt Rambis as our coach, and all the stuff that happened since you left, you wouldn't even believe it, and, oh, Kevin Love and the knuckle push-ups, and, oh, God, thank you. It was just a dream. I'm stepping out of the shower. It was all a dream. Like, you get
the Randy Foye era is over.
Yes, exactly. And so... I think part of that was at work with Shane, and so I am curious how they follow up on it. I brought up ProWrestling.net too, and just to double check that we're not don't have hateful, spiteful torch readers. And over at .net, it's 59% thumbs down, 26% average, and 15% thumbs up. So almost identical.
Just one thing on that. I don't know that if I'd read as much into the Shane thing as sort of being an indictment of the creative direction or anything. I really think it was more just the fact that we haven't seen him forever, and there's more of a reality to that situation. People know that Shane had left the company. And it wasn't just like someone that was sort of a character that was gone for a while. Like there'd been a real, him leaving the company. I mean, we don't know what went on behind the scenes exactly, but it was, I'm sure there were a lot of frayed feelings over the way that whole thing went down, and people seeing him return, a familiar face they haven't seen in a long period of time and left under sort of, not necessarily the best circumstances. That's the sort of return that's going to tend to get a bigger reaction. So I think that was sort of the principal causation there.
Anything else on the WrestleMania lineup itself and how it's shaping up? How do you grade it?
No, we pretty much covered it. I mean, I think that
they're recovering nicely though from our. I mean, is this a WrestleMania worthy lineup? I guess I'm more macro at this point.
No.
Okay, that's what I wanted to get.
They're trying, but no,
Yeah.
It's not a particularly good lineup at all.
And if Rock gets involved, that adds some star power. Obviously, if there's some ace up their sleeve with Ronda Rousey or something like that, that gives it more of that quote WrestleMania vibe. It's different than the other 11 months of the year.
I think it's pretty safe to say at this point Ronda Rousey is not going to be involved. They would have shot an angle by now if they had something with Ronda Rousey.
So then
and besides, she has other stuff going on. I mean, she wasn't going to do anyway. But I mean, even if she had worked out some sort of thing, it's not going to happen.
So then Ryback turned heel and gets pelted with Goldberg chants all the time. Would Vince do something like that? Do you think he'd think that was worth a payday?
I think that if they were planning in that direction, given how loud the Goldberg chants were in the very match that he turned, that when he did the backstage segment, he would have said something about that.
Interesting. Yeah, good. That's an interesting point. Yeah. So, all that said, if they don't add anything else to the lineup other than they had in a far distant memory of mine mentioned The Rock.
Hold on. Wait, sorry. Since we're sort of going in a different direction, just one other thing on the Ryback point.
Yeah.
I think some people overestimate the interest in a Goldberg-Ryback match because there are constantly people chanting that. I don't think the Goldberg chants at Ryback are, we really want to see Goldberg versus Ryback. This is a match that really means something to us. I think it's a derisive, we think you're just a ripoff of this other guy, and we're letting you know that we think you suck chant. I think it says a lot more about fans' negative opinion of Ryback than it does about their desire to see Goldberg wrestle one more match. And I think because of that, people tend to overrate the amount of interest that there would be for Goldberg coming back.
Do you think WWE sees it that way, and that they see Goldberg as that WCW guy who bombed when he was here? Or do you think, well, last year was Sting, this year if we get access to Goldberg, let's do it. Too many guys are injured.
I think the big thing is just the personal element. I mean, he had such a rocky run with Vince the last time around that I think, you may get that if you had a deeper discussion about it with Vince. But I think more likely if you just raise the issue of Goldberg, you just go, fuck that guy. It's something else.
Yep. All right, very good. So, Impact lockdown last night. Disappointing numbers as far as the ratings went. They were down from the week before. But what do you think of the execution of it?
I thought it was a good show. I mean, obviously the big angle was the Spud turn at the end, and we talked earlier about sort of motivations and things making sense. I mean, this was very, very logical. You have Spud, this guy who had the long-standing history with EC3, and you want Spud to, at least I won't speak for anyone else. Sorry. Did you have another question, by the way, before? Because I wanted to interject on the Ryback thing, but you were going to ask a question about WrestleMania that sort of got shifted aside.
Oh, good point. I don't remember, but I know as I was asking it, I don't feel like it was super, super vital. But if it pops into my head, we'll go back to it. But no big deal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I wanted watching this because I like.
You know what?
Spud.
I thought of what it is. Let me just get it out of the way. Do you think they have anything else up their sleeve? We kind of ruled out Rousey. You kind of downplayed Goldberg for personal reasons and other reasons. Do you think there's anything else they're going to do to elevate this, or are we down to Money in the Bank, Kevin Owens, AJ, or Jericho, or something? I mean, is it just kind of filling it in now? Is this it?
I think there probably is some other hook, but I think we got the key stuff.
Yeah.
I think there probably is one more little stronger hook to build up the show, but I'm not sure. I guess The Rock would fit into that. It would fit into that category because they've announced The Rock's going to do something. So the Rock announcement would definitely be of sort of whatever he's doing, whether it's a host or a ref or something or other. I think that would be a clear thing. And they still also, if they wanted to, I don't know if they will, could announce something with Steve Austin. And I know he'll be involved, but the question is whether he sort of makes a cameo and it's sort of a fun thing to add onto the show, or whether they try to make it something important as part of the show. And, we'll see on that. I think that's another thing that's sort of lingering there.
Before I go deep into Impact 2, just to note that Jim Ross will be on the PW Torch livecast tomorrow, and we'll be talking about all that we just talked about with you, Todd. The Shane McMahon thing, the dynamic behind the scenes, his thoughts on the future, WrestleMania lineup, and all that. So just want to throw a quick plug in there, because VIP members, we certainly welcome your phone calls during the show. Email ahead of time, pwtorchlivecast@gmail.com. Put your name and phone number in the subject line. I'll see your number and mark you down and move you into the VIP Express lane on our switchboard. So we certainly welcome VIP members joining the conversation with Jim Ross and me tomorrow.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah.
So going back to Spud, I want Spud and EC3 to get together because I like Spud. He's a very likable presence, and EC3 is the babyface that's rising up, and so them forming an alliance against Matt Hardy and Tyrus and Rebby and Evil Maxwell. It's a
Evil Maxwell.
Yes, he's a troubled child, fallen in with the wrong crowd. So I mean, you've got this whole crew against him, and so Spud is sort of sticking up for EC3, and you remember the good times together. But ultimately, if you're telling the story in the most if you're thinking about it just from a logical standpoint, would Spud fully forgive EC3 after what a jerk EC3 was to him? No, probably not. Even if EC3 has turned around his act and done things the right way, he's probably lost with Spud. Just like, if somebody does wrong by you years and years ago and they turn into a better person and they're living a good life, that you're still probably not going to get along with them because they treated you so poorly back in the day, and that's just going to stick with it. And that's the story they told. And
who's
Spud,
like that in your life, Todd?
No comment. There are people like that.
Yes.
So I think there are with everyone. So Yeah, so I mean, it's sort of it's sort of sad because you want them to get together, but it makes perfect sense that they wouldn't because of what Spud's done. It does, I think, make it, although this didn't manifest itself on Monday. It does, I think, make it a little bit more difficult to dislike Spud, because he has such good reasons for not liking EC3 and not wanting to help out EC3. But we'll see what they do with that. I mean, he was acting, diabolical. He had an evil grin. If he had a mustache, I'm sure he would have twirled it. So we'll see what he can do there. But yeah, it's hard to fault Spud in that whole thing. And then yeah, what else on the show? I guess, one other thing I really liked, and maybe it's partly nostalgia, but I always thought it was a very good touch, was WWF used to do the thing for big matches where they'd follow the guys backstage on the way to the ring. And I thought it was just a cool little way to distinguish the biggest matches. I remember they did that for Montreal, and they did that for a number of big Shawn Michaels matches around the 94 to 98 period. And TNA, I had completely forgotten about this habit, but they did it for EC3 versus Matt Hardy, and I thought it really worked well. It sort of added the drama where you sort of followed them walking backstage. It's like, oh, here they come out, and you start to hear the crowd reacting when they're getting close to the curtain, and they come out, and it's like, ooh, here comes the match. I always thought that was a nice little touch, and I'm glad TNA brought it back. I thought it was a smart move. Yeah, go ahead.
May through December, we'd talk about Impact everyone now and then, be like, nothing really to comment on. What is different? Can you capsulize what's different and better and more notable about the show these first 7 weeks into the year compared to last year, the year before that? Is it that much better, or did they just kind of hit the reset button? It's new in the season, so we're giving them a chance to talk about them again.
Well, I thought the promotion was doing. I thought the promotion has generally been pretty good, ever since they got rid of Vince Russo in those New York shows. I really think like the promotion has generally been pretty well booked since then. The period that you meant over the last, whatever it was, that December period through whenever they were doing the tournament, that was obviously a weaker period because they were cobbling together a bunch of old matches and trying to make sense of it in the context of this tournament. And you could tell, it was a bunch of old matches that they then tried to make it look like it was live, and it just wasn't as interesting. Now they're back to actually booking together television shows and putting them together, and that has made it better. So I guess that would be a distinction. As far as though, I mean, your question seems to imply that you think that it's better right now than it was during the period they were doing live programming before they went dead. And I mean, maybe they are to some degree. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but it doesn't jump out at me in sort of a strong manner. So if you sort of, since you sort of had some sort of, I guess there's an underlying sentiment behind it. What do you think is the difference, if there is one?
Well, I do think it's better, but I wouldn't call it an underlying sentiment as much as a very specific observation about the fact that we talk about it almost every week now. Oh, you know why?
Tuesday. Tuesday.
Yes, thank you. I just thought of that when you did. That's why it's very timely. So that answers my question. I was searching for why do we talk about it every week now?
Same reason we don't talk about NXT all that much.
Yeah. Okay. No, but I will say I do think it's better, but I think part of it was hitting the reset button and the EC3 turn, the influx of some new talent. It felt like the new season. I'm way more into the Timberwolves and the Wild and like early in the season, and then they break my heart after about 4, 5, 6 weeks, and I don't like them anymore. I'm bored with them, or it's hit or miss, and then I check in January, and then whatever. So part of that is just like, oh well, they were kind of dark for a while, but it's hard to put my finger on it, but I do think there's something better, and it's a lot of the little things. But I think they've been moving that direction. That I think this year so far is a culmination of an increasingly large number of good choices they've made week to week and small decisions and improvements, micro improvements that they've made for a few years. And I guess ever since, I think things started for my taste to take off in a better direction once Dixie went through a table. It's like, okay, we're done. Let's move forward. Let's get away from that. To me, this is a show that's self-contained. it's not spectacular world-class wrestling. I wouldn't say there's even spectacular world-class promos, although they're certainly good. But it's the most stripped-down, simple narrative that I think is when wrestling's at its best, when the characters are clearly defined as faces or heels. There's a clear hierarchy. Winning and losing matters where you go up or down in the hierarchy. And there's not a ton of wrestlers, but the wrestlers on the brand, on the show, are on missions. They're all on journeys, and we're watching it play out. And I think the characters are reacting naturally the way that they would. They've got a constitution to them, and the booking has integrity that takes into account the constitutions of the characters. And it's about winning matches and titles. So even with, I think, weak announcing and not over-the-top great production values, but solid.
I've had enough of your Pope bashing. Come on.
That's more of a Josh bashing, actually, because Pope doesn't even say that much. But and it's not bashing Josh. I just don't think he adds. I don't think he adds to the show. But I don't think Josh is a good announcer. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and say it. And you've said that before. I don't think he adds to the show. I think he does just enough to kind of stay out of the way, I guess. You want better than that. But I don't. And the shame too is that when Jeremy Borash has been in that role, he's been very good. I know. Yeah, I think Tenay was better than Josh is now most of the time, and I agree. I think that Jeremy would be better. I agree on Tenay. The thing with Tenay though is that he is associated with those bad years of TNA so much that I think there was sort of it's a similar deal to like guys like Wade Barrett or Dolph Ziggler, where they're in that WWE mix for so long that they just are sort of defined in a certain way, and I think it's a negative, and it's not their fault, but it's just the way they're defined. And I view Mike Tenay that way from an announcing capacity. He's so associated in my mind with bad TNA wrestling that I think putting him as the voice of good TNA wrestling still, I think it brings back the memories of the bad TNA wrestling. So I think you want a different voice. Yeah. But Josh, I don't think is that voice. I think another thing, as we're talking about the announcers, that I like about this year better than last year is they're not doing that stupid "we're in the studio" thing. Yeah. Or we have hidden cameras in the locker room, which they dropped the idea of that very quickly when they realized how creepy and useless that was. But Dixie was very high on it when she was on the livecast a year ago, talking about we're going to have cameras everywhere. We're going to take you behind the scenes. It's one of those things that irks me because it was a pitch made to somebody at a network who doesn't understand wrestling and thinks that's how you reinvent things. We're going to have hidden cameras and black globes everywhere, and people won't know when they're on or off, and it'll be great. And then you're like, you actually try to do something with it, and you just realize, well, this is just a waste of time. Let's try to make some money here. I didn't think the hidden cameras made a big difference to me, but I thinking about the announcing of showing the guys in like the dark room, watching the matches, I hadn't even thought about that in a while. But I think that was a definite tonal advantage to the current shows as they stopped doing that, because I hadn't even thought about it until now. But I thought that was now that I can think of the programming back when they had it, I was like, ugh. So like the fact that's not there anymore, I think is a definite positive. And one other thing you're mentioning earlier, essentially one of the things you like about Impact is sort of the stripped down, straightforward nature of it. And it's the same thing that NXT has going for it. It's the same thing ROH has going for it. I think a lot of the better wrestling shows right now are ones where you just sort of stick to the fundamentals. Yeah. And at the point that you stick to the fundamentals and you get that right, that's when you can start pulling out stuff and making it feel special. And I think sometimes, particularly with ROH, I think they get so focused on the fundamentals that you don't see much in the way of bells and whistles when they could afford to do that more. But that's sort of like the next step. At least if you got a good foundation, that's better than sort of wildly, doing all sorts of stuff that's harmful to the destructive, one might say, to the foundation. Yeah, I think I don't want to get too deep into the muck of the bad habits from the Monday Night War, but there was a time where I just think there was this frenzied desperation to do something every single second, because as soon as there was a pause, people are going to switch to the other channel. And I think for years now, there's been an underestimation of people turning on a wrestling show and wanting to watch for 2 hours an enjoyable wrestling show with a narrative structure that makes some sense. And that they're not just with their finger on the remote going, oh my God, you didn't do something sexist or sexy or pop culture reference or weapon oriented or whatever, or you didn't turn somebody or break up a team in the last 2 minutes, so I'm changing the channel. And this doesn't feel like a real person you've created, Wade. I don't imagine this person saying that. So now you can.
It feels like you created a fake person to fit the point that you make.
So I like that now you can tune into Impact and have a feeling that you're settling in for a show that has the confidence you're going to stick around. It's like going on a date with somebody who's just constantly trying to keep you from getting up and leaving the date. It's like, no, just have some confidence that they're going to stick around till the bill comes.
That also doesn't sound very realistic, but hey, like maybe that'll happen one of these days. That's a bad sign. That's a bad sign if it does. One other thing though,
yes,
and sometimes when I think about, we frequently talk about the flaws of WWE in particular, and we notice the flaws when they're going on because they're on a week-to-week basis, but sometimes we miss when they correct those flaws. And sometimes I'll be thinking about it and I'll be like, oh, they correct that flaw. Like, for example, they had a problem for a while where they were changing titles all the time and they devalued the titles. But then WWE made the edict that they weren't going to change the titles as much, and they created more value in the titles because they didn't do all these title changes, and they didn't get a lot of credit for it because people didn't even notice it. They just sort of accepted that as the new normal. And I will say, in terms of the pace of the programming, because I think there are a lot of issues with the show, and I think probably in some ways too, they do feel the need to do too many angles. But I think both with TNA and WWE, there has been a slowing down in terms of WWE feeling comfortable with having longer matches, because there was a period where you'd get these short matches and they move to something else and they do another short match, and they started having longer matches, which paced out the shows better. TNA would always be cutting the back and doing this and that. They stopped doing that as much. Both of those shows have slowed down to some degree. And I think there's still room to go with WWE, but I think those are actually positive corrections that they've made, and they aren't as bad as they were at their worst.
Yes, I agree. All right, Edge and Christian, I want your review.
This show was the Kimbo Slice versus Dada 5000 of shows. Someone tweeted us that we should do a review every week, and to that I say no. That's not happening. I made it about 12 minutes. I'd seen the ads. Did you watch this thing? You said something about having it on the background, but
I had it on in the background. I hate watched it for about 8 minutes and hate chuckled a couple times, but I still hated it.
Yeah, I saw the ads for it, and I thought, wow, this looks really bad. But I do like both Edge and Christian, so I decided I'd give it a chance, at least so that if someone asked, I could say honestly whether it was trash or not without having just seen the commercials. But I mean, this show is just a catastrophe. Nobody watched this show. It's dreadful. A dreadful show.
Now, is it worse than what we saw on Raw on the pay-per-view on
Much
Sunday?
Worse.
Yeah.
Much worse. Yes. Yeah. How was watching that show on a loop? No thanks.
So, do you want to explain what was so bad about it? Do you think there's an audience for it?
No, not really. It was really bad humor. They did this long skit with Vince McMahon, and they were doing this skit. What the hell was that other skit? I just tried to block it out of my mind immediately. They were like saying stuff over old clips or something. Like it was like, was it songs or poems or something? It was terrible. Every joke was falling completely flat. I just at some point my brain was just hurting too much, and I had to turn it off.
Yes. Is there do you think that it's not your bag? It's not for you. I get that. Not for me either. No,
I hope so, because
you made that pretty clear.
You really wouldn't have been paying attention to me if you didn't get that much.
I'm just resetting things. I'm just saying, we're back from the break. Todd Martin has established, in case you missed it before the break.
Wade's doing laundry in the background. What's he saying about this? I think he didn't like it, but I'm not so sure.
So that's established. It's not your thing. Understatement. Is it worth doing because it's other people's thing? Like, do you think there's a niche audience for it that makes it worth doing this low production original programming to put in the mix?
I mean, they do a lot of shows. I mean, I'm reticent to sort of speak for other people's tastes, because I mean, if you look at television, a lot of the shows that are better shows in terms of both what critics say in terms of what I think are better shows frequently are not very well written. Like, I'll give you the perfect example. I never watch any CW shows, but I'd heard good advance reviews, and the fact that it was originally shot for Showtime. And so I decided to actually try a pilot of a CW show, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, with Rachel Bloom. And this is a great show. It's funny and it's smart and it's interesting. And it got, I think it won a Golden Globe for Rachel Bloom in her performance in this show. And nobody watches this show. Nobody watches this show, even by CW standards. It gets like a 0.1 or something, a 0.1, a 0.2. Nobody watches this show. So like the correlation between, and meanwhile, like the newest version of like NCIS or CSI that's just sort of derivative of a show they've done a million times before, draws these big ratings. So like people have their own tastes, it's whatever. As far as like if I'm a WWE executive and I'm looking at like what do we want on this network to have like a bunch of different shows, I certainly wouldn't be greenlighting a second season of this show just because of how bad it was.
Yeah.
But who knows? I mean, you look at the numbers, maybe a bunch of people tune in and then you get a bunch of people and then you watch the second episode. The second episode was actually the next night. So you could get a feeling and
keep the momentum going.
Yeah, you can look at the viewership numbers and maybe it had higher retention rates than Table of Three, which I thought was, or Table of 4-3, whatever it's called, that I thought was really good. I mean the numbers probably bear it out better than anything else, particularly when you're like a niche service, because like whether it's HBO or Netflix or Amazon, they can play by different rules than the networks that have to just try to draw the biggest audience possible. They can say, hey, this draws this many people, but it fills a niche, and a certain group of fans are more likely to subscribe to our service because we have this out here, so we'll keep it going even though it isn't that broad-based of support. Whereas something else, it may have a larger viewing audience, but it's people that aren't as attached to the programming. It's just something they watch. But if you got rid of it, they wouldn't really care. So I mean, they've got all sorts of analysis for this sort of thing. I can't pretend to have any great insight into the metrics of WWE Network in terms of what's driving subscribers and what isn't.
Yep. This is PWTorch.com editor Wade Keller, along with Torch audio host and contributor and columnist Todd Martin, and this is The Fix with Todd Martin, recorded Tuesday, March 1st, 2016. Happy Tuesday, Todd. I don't know what kind of mood you're usually in on Tuesdays. I hope it's similar to your good mood on Wednesdays.
I'm in a good mood every day that I talk with you, Wade, is a fine day, and it's Super Tuesday, special election special of the Fix. It's a day early and $1 extra.
Actually, it'll be $1 short from a time standpoint because I got to get out the door to caucus in about 45 minutes. But so a little bit different schedule this week. So part one will be a little bit shorter than usual, and we'll figure out part two from there afterwards. Well, let's dive into it, Todd. The episode of Raw last night, we'll just get right to the most current news. Set the stage for WWE Roadblock, a roadblock on the fast lane to the road to WrestleMania. Triple H against Dean Ambrose.
No, hold up. A roadblock after the fast lane on the way to WrestleMania.
Yes, I just kind of thought Fastlane happened, but we were still sort of in it. It launches a Fastlane. I don't know. So your take on the setting up of Hunter versus Dean at the beginning of the show, the announcement at the end, and then the Tuesday announcement, today's announcement, that the match will take place on March 12th, Saturday, live from Toronto, live on WWE Network, hopefully with Mauro Ranallo calling the action.
Yeah, you can say that again.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm sort of two minds on it. I mean, on the positive side, it's good for them to add a hook to this Toronto show. And the last network special they did, it didn't really feel, not the last network special, but the last sort of house show that they televised, the Madison Square Garden one, it didn't really feel special. It just felt like a house show. And this time around, they're giving some storyline reason. They're giving some reason to want to tune in to make it feel more important. Now, the flip side of that is that it's WrestleMania season. WrestleMania is coming up. Are they going to sell any additional subscriptions with this show? No, probably not. So it's not as big of a priority. As far as like actually doing it, again, I can sort of see the pros and cons of it. The pros, I think the idea is to build up Triple H to get him ready for the match with Roman Reigns at WrestleMania. But if that comes at the expense of Dean Ambrose, I'm not sure how good of an idea that is. It also just could be a deal where they don't really have a decisive finish one way or another. It sort of tries to protect both guys. So we'll see where it goes with that. I can sort of see both, pros and cons to the approach.
It is an unprovable minor point, so let's talk about it. I think they'll sell some network subs, Todd. I think that there's people who are waiting till the last second to order WrestleMania weekend for NXT TakeOver and WrestleMania, and I think some of them who kind of pick and choose their times. Their Royal Rumble month ran out, and they were going to wait till first weekend of April, and this gives them something that feels newsworthy. I think there's maybe more curiosity because of the hook and the buildup of Raw and Triple H's one and only title defense, and I think it might give a little bit of boost to the quarter-one numbers for the network.
Seriously?
Yeah, I'm totally serious.
I don't see it at all. I don't think there's anyone that. I mean, I guess you could say maybe there are a few people that might subscribe a couple weeks early, before WrestleMania.
That's what I mean.
Okay, so I mean that's not even $9.99. That's potentially $4 or something. I mean, if you I mean if you get out after WrestleMania, then it's sort of a moot point. But I mean, I guess if they're long-term subscribers that subscribe before this show rather than right before WrestleMania, it'll lead to a small net return over the long haul. But I don't know. I really don't think there are a lot of people out there that are saying Dean Ambrose versus Triple H. Now's my chance to hop in when they didn't do so for the Royal Rumble, or people that are sort of there. There hasn't been a lot of people that are sort of jumping in and out. So I don't know who's jumping in for the Royal Rumble and Fastlane, and then jumping out, but then jumping in quickly again because they've got this special.
What do you think accounts for the high churn rate if people aren't leaving and then coming back?
Well, I think it's been more the situation that they've been getting additional clearances over time, where they keep adding these different areas, and meanwhile people are sort of dropping off the network over time. So I think a lot of what's been portrayed as sort of people going in and out is more the case of getting additional subscribers and having subscribers fall off during the non-peak times.
Okay, yep. Yeah, and I'm with you. I mean, in the sense that if somebody's going to order WrestleMania, all I'm saying is they might order a couple weeks early now or 3 weeks early, and then be counted in quarter one, whereas they might have waited till April 1st or 2nd or 3rd otherwise. But like I said, impossible to prove in minor points, so let's debate it. Undertaker's big promo, they hyped it. Undertaker's going to speak on the matter. He barely did. He made it clear he's not friends with Vince McMahon because he choked him and apparently almost gave him some sort of heart attack. But said very few words other than he doesn't plan to take it easy on Shane, but he will fight for the cause of keeping Vince and Stephanie and Hunter in control.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't sure what angle to hit it there. I mean, I didn't think it was particularly notable one way or another. It was just sort of it felt like a week where they wanted to get Undertaker in there to sort of get him in there, but they didn't want to really show their hand at all as far as where they're going with this. So they pointed out something that would have likely been obvious before, that Undertaker's probably not particularly happy about the idea of being Vince McMahon's lackey, and that this may in fact not turn out as well for Vince McMahon as he's hoping, which I think most people would have expected last week, not knowing exactly how it shakes out. But they didn't really get much of a signal as to what The Undertaker will be doing about this, or whether Vince McMahon is overconfident in his chances, given that Undertaker's something of a wild card in this scenario.
Was it a satisfactory chapter 2 to the Shane Undertaker storyline, or is it holding back, Todd, or is it revealing they're not sure how to even address it? I mean, and yes, you can say, well, let's wait and see. Shane and Undertaker will be there next week. But what's your hunch? Is this a sign that there's not a lot of depth to this idea? They just didn't have a lot of good options, and they went with this and thought it would get a buzz, but there's not a lot of storyline support that Undertaker can add because it just won't make sense.
Well, even if there isn't a lot of storyline support to make it make sense, I do think they have a basic idea of what they're doing, whatever that is. The idea that Undertaker is going to defeat Shane McMahon and send him off, but then also attack Vince McMahon. I'm just throwing out a scenario.
Yeah.
Or, the scenario I threw out that Roman Reigns helps Shane and they take over the company as heels. Regardless of whatever that scenario is, the scenario may not make sense in the larger context, and the Shane McMahon the bringing back of Shane McMahon may be, as you point to, a desperation move that they didn't think through that carefully. But regardless of those factors, I do think they have a basic idea of what they're doing, and I don't think they would have brought back Shane McMahon without a basic idea of what they're doing at WrestleMania. And they gave you no indications as far as those basic cards of what sort of thing we're going to get.
And I guess I'm working from the premise that they know what they're doing, and the best scenario... Dangerous premise in general. That's true. I'm going with the premise that they know where they're going. They have an idea of what they're going to do through WrestleMania. Broad brushstrokes at the very least, getting there, and a very precise scenario, or quite precise scenario, at the show. And my working theory is that doesn't involve Undertaker being able to say very much, because there's just not a lot he can say that will make sense. So you have to kind of keep that to a minimum and keep the focus on the McMahon family and that dynamic. And Undertaker's a bit of a pawn and just a destructive force who's a threat, but it's not really about his legacy, his personality, his opinion on the McMahons, his taking sides. He's the guy who McMahon said, here's your opponent, I'm your boss, you do what you do. And Taker's made it clear, okay, I'll do what I do because that's what I do, and the blood will be on your hands, Vince, and I don't like you, Vince. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I like to beat people up and cause them to bleed in cages. Or he has something else going on. We'll see. Yeah, and that was my question: is there something else going on or not? And I just don't know. I mean, I think they would have shown more of their hand last night if there was something more. I think it seemed like a bit of a letdown, having so few words from Taker. Stephanie's promo, Todd, was an interesting rebuttal to Shane, and that at times I was sort of nodding along. Like, yeah, good point. Okay, yeah, daughter should have every right to take over a company just like guys. And Shane seemed a little chauvinist in the at least the inference that I think some of us made in Shane's tone was he was implying men should be first in line to the throne. But your thoughts on the Stephanie promo in general, and maybe that specifically too?
Yeah, Stephanie may be the only person out there who dislikes Shane more than you do. So she has that going for her. I thought that... I
don't dislike Shane. I dislike Shane conceptually in a main event against an actual wrestler. That's what I'm against. I think Shane is a very nice guy. I've made that very clear, that he's very popular and well-liked, and probably one of the better McMahons out of all the kids and all the grandparents.
Yeah, right, I'm teasing you, but
no, I know.
particularly given that I've sort of made the same sort of parsing with John Cena over the years. But you've just buried this guy over and over this week. It's been a week-long vicious burial of the poor guy. I think people are feeling sorry for him at this point. Here's the thing with Stephanie. The Shane McMahon thing last year was sort of novel because Shane McMahon is fresh as a character and he's wrestling with The Undertaker, who's also a very over character. Stephanie, whether she does a good job or a bad job, she has go-away heat with me. I don't like seeing her on television. It feels like, actually, it's sort of some of the same criticism you make of Shane McMahon, that it's sort of about Shane McMahon over the wrestlers that he's around. And to me, as I mentioned last week, Shane McMahon in most of the programs he's been involved with has been about getting over talent, whereas Stephanie McMahon almost I'm not even most. Like, every program she's involved with is about getting herself over at the expense of whoever else is around her. So I don't really enjoy seeing her in any capacity, and the McMahon power struggle is a particularly uncompelling direction. So regardless of whether she's portraying a good heel or however you would want to frame it, it's not something that carries a lot of interest with me. So I just assume she'd be gone in any capacity, quite frankly. And it's not. I don't really get any enjoyment out of any of her segments.
Expand on what you meant when you said that when Shane is there, it's usually about getting other guys over or other wrestlers over, not him.
Because the programs almost always involve the other people destroying Shane McMahon at the end. I mean, from the feud he did with Kurt Angle, where Kurt just completely destroyed him, to the feud with X-Pac that was, I think, really sort of the hottest point for X-Pac during his WWF run, was him going after this entitled Shane McMahon as part of DX, to the Test feud that was designed to elevate Test and get him to a higher level and involve Test destroying him, to the Kane program, which was about Kane destroying him and being presented as a monster after he took off his mask. I mean, in general, the programs, if you look at them from beginning to end, they involve Shane McMahon putting over other people, whereas a Stephanie McMahon or Stephanie browbeating people week after week, and then if she has a match at the end, she beats the person that she's involved with, and if she doesn't have the match at the end, it just involves them being neutered and sort of walking away with their tail between their legs because she's verbally castrated them.
Yes, Stephanie does have a tendency to do that. It was interesting last week when Steph actually showed a tiny bit of fear selling for Shane and his presence in the presence of Daddy. Tell me that's not true. Tell me that's not true. She sold a little bit. It was interesting to see that side of her when normally, it's how high can my heels be so I look down at you and make you seem small, literally and figuratively in her dynamic with people.
Yeah.
Okay, so also on, well, not a lot else on Raw, but let's see, Y2AJ team. Any thoughts on the advancement of that? And a theory, I was just talking to Jason Paul about on the live cast, and callers are wondering, is this where are they headed as they go to WrestleMania? What are a couple options, and what do you think is the most likely course?
Well, it seems clear, at least to me, that they're going to break up and get back into feuding at some point. And it's sort of a question of when. And they could time it at different times. I think the obvious direction is AJ, because AJ is a babyface and Jericho is the disgruntled veteran leading into another feud between them. They could decide to advance it a little bit longer, make it go for even a few months. I mean, I think what they're doing right now is perfectly viable as sort of a midterm direction. But I could see them also breaking it up as soon as next week and moving right into the WrestleMania program. So I wouldn't be surprised by either direction. What else were you sort of speculating in that regard?
Just that's my take. But somebody called up just wondering, are they going to face each other at WrestleMania, or will the teaming go on longer, or will there not actually be a breakup? They'll actually team and then they'll go their separate ways without the breakup. I just think they're lulling you into a sense of security that that bitterness Jericho had is gone. They've learned to get along, and when your guard is down, that's when the turn happens. And I mean, I think my money's on AJ and Jericho at WrestleMania one-on-one, but I think there's not everybody wants that. And I also think some people just got their hopes up for an AJ Kevin Owens showcase, but there's still some fear that it'll be just AJ throwing in a Money in the Bank match or something.
Yeah, and in regards to what you were just describing about whether they'll break up, whether they'll team up for a little bit longer, and people sort of wanting Jericho to not turn on AJ and to sort of keep together, that's a good dynamic. That's the sort of thing I like about pro wrestling. You set up an issue with two faces and you make the fans want to see them get along, but you sort of sense in the back of your head, this probably isn't going to work out, but we don't know when it's going to fall apart. Yeah. And then when it does fall apart, you're frustrated and you're angry at the heel for doing what you were sort of expecting the whole time, but hoping that they wouldn't. And when it happens, it feels like a natural part of the story. I contrast it to something else they did on Monday, which was the double pin with Becky Lynch and Sasha Banks, where the AJ and Jericho thing, you sort of sense that at some point they might turn on each other, but they're telling a natural story where they're teaming together, they're winning matches. You don't necessarily know what's going to happen at any point in time. It doesn't feel like it's booked. It doesn't feel like you're watching an angle in a pro wrestling show. It feels like a natural story that's progressing. Whereas with Sasha and Becky Lynch, you can do a double pin. I mean, there have been plenty of effective double pins over the years, but it's best to be done out of the blue so that it feels like it's a natural progression of a story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Sasha and Becky Lynch, the obvious direction going into them having this match was going to be a three-way WrestleMania. It was obviously what they're teasing. The people who are watching, who are smarter now than they've been in the past, were obviously thinking this is going to lead to a three-way. And then they have this singles match, and it leads in a double pin. And it just felt so fake and contrived and hard to get into because it felt like a pro wrestling angle to get to the next point in the pro wrestling story. It didn't feel like a natural story that you were watching. It was impossible to take yourself out of it because I think the vast majority of the adult audience, maybe children are buying into this, the vast majority of the audience when they watch that double pin is, they're obviously going to a three-way because that's what they're setting up before. So now they're doing the double pin finish to get to the thing, as opposed to
very rare finish.
Yes,
yeah.
As opposed to you're watching this match, you don't know what's going to happen, and then, these people have been pinned together. Where is this going to lead? What's going to happen from here? Where it feels more natural, it feels more organic, it feels more real.
I really enjoy JBL's speculation that this double pin 6 weeks out from Mania means Charlotte gets the night off.
Yes.
At WrestleMania. That was great insight from JBL. There's no way we can solve this in the next 5-6 weeks. This is it. It's over. Charlotte's get the night off.
Well, Wade, you weren't listening to the pre-match stipulation. The winner of that match was against Charlotte at WrestleMania. So therefore, logically, if there's no winner for that match, there is no match with Charlotte at WrestleMania.
Okay, Justice Scalia.
you keep throwing in these things, trying to get me to bite. I one of these days.
It's
Wade, I tell you.
It's not for a guy. He's just a strict letter of the Constitution type guy, and you're very letter of the law on this. So. But you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think you probably know better than I do. All right.
I have no comments I wish to voice on Antonin Scalia on this show.
Okay. WrestleMania betting odds are in. Roman Reigns opened as a big negative 540 favorite. I don't know how to use the terminology. It's like Trump quoting the Bible. I don't know how to use the term.
See, there you go again. Right back to it, Wade.
Is it Corinthians 2?
That I wouldn't know.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Not my area of expertise.
But the betting lines, I think it's negative 540, but it could be some other term. But there's a negative sign in front of a 540, which means Roman Reigns is a big favorite. Brock Lesnar, a pretty big favorite to beat Dean, and Undertaker, a pretty big favorite to beat Shane. Anything there seem out of whack on early betting lines? In as much as it's completely stupid to talk about betting in pro wrestling, but establishing that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like insider knowledge or anything. I mean, it seems to me pretty. Roman Reigns winning seems pretty obvious as a finish, and Brock winning also seems pretty obvious as a finish.
It's that third one that I kind of raised an eyebrow at, that most people think Undertaker will beat Shane and Shane won't get control of Raw, and it very well might happen. But it seems like a lot of the build on TV has been giving people this hope that there'll be a dawning of a new era the day after Mania.
Yeah, I think probably the key is that, there have been reports out that Shane's only going to be there through WrestleMania, which, if true, would obviously suggest that he's unlikely to win the match.
Yeah, and I guess that would be what would sway the betting lines. Although he's certainly left the door open, and I think in comments he's made, he hasn't closed the door on it, but I think that any kind of word getting out that it's a short-term thing does hurt the build-up and the build-up to the match, and people wondering what the finish will be. Although, certainly, I mean, it's hard to imagine I should say it's hard to imagine. I can imagine plenty of circumstances where Shane pins Undertaker. I'm not quite sure I like any of them. Undertaker should beat Shane. I mean, just not from a storyline result, just from a pure...
I hate Shane McMahon. I don't want to win this match.
Thank you. Those were the words I was looking for, Todd, and you found them so well for me. All right. By the way, anything else from Raw? I didn't mean to jump off that. Did you have any other talking points or rants or?
No rants per se, but one thing you had speculated that because they had backed off on Triple H acting heelish this week, with him acting babyface-ish this week, with him going after Dean Ambrose in pretty heel terms, and them moving away from the sort of the things that he'd done last week that made him more likable. That you'd said that essentially that was proof that last week was Triple H.
Evidence. Did I say proof?
Well, I mean, you might not have said proof. In fact,
Gotcha.
I would have no idea.
I finally got you to back down and admit you might have. No, go ahead.
The point being, regardless of what the words you were saying, you were pretty strong on the idea that it suggested that last week Triple H was just sort of, not going into business for himself, but not taking into account where Roman Reigns was coming from. And I would counter that I would not be so sure. I think that if they are doing a double turn at WrestleMania, and I seem to be the only one at this point who's so convinced, but I am convinced they're doing a double turn at this point. I really am, Wade. And I have not been thinking that they were going to do a double turn for much of this time. I really think from the lack of the heels that they're setting up, from the little teases here and there, to the fact that WrestleMania is a natural break point, to the fact that it's been such a long period of time. It's so clear at this time. I really think they're going to do this double turn at WrestleMania. But if you're doing the double turn at WrestleMania, the key is you're doing it at WrestleMania. The way you do, if you're going to do that, you want to set it up over time. Yeah. You want to build it up. You want to give little teases and then withdraw, and then teases and then withdraw. That's the way you build up an important angle. You don't go all the way with it from the very beginning, and then at that point there's nowhere to go from that. So if they are doing that, and maybe they aren't, but if they are doing that, I would expect the sort of thing of them pulling back a little bit once they go with that, because they don't want to go so far that it's clear what they're doing beforehand, and you lose the emotional traction of the big angle at WrestleMania.
No, that's true, and Hunter is proving this week that he wants to set the stage for babyface turn by proving he's a fighting champion.
That's yeah.
I'm both sarcastic and serious. I mean,
on one hand, he is taking on this guy when he doesn't need to, but on the other hand, obviously setting the table so that he has the advantage.
Plus, only one title defense in 2 months. 2+
yeah,
months. So.
Yeah. Although, hey, the Rock didn't have a lot of title defenses either.
No, he didn't. I was not pleased with that either. But
I loved it. I thought it was great. The less title defenses, the better.
Wait a second. You've argued the opposite. I know you have. I'm court reporter. Check.
I have done no such thing. Wait, how many times are you going to call me a liar on just this individual show? This is terrible. I'm being berated here.
All right. Well, let's calm down. Let's cool off, everybody. All right. I'm tempted now to get you riled up by asking you what you think of the drop-off in the third hour this week on the Raw rating. Not as steep as last week, but it's there. No. All right. Anything else from Raw? Because I'm ready to move on. Okay. ROH, pay-per-view Friday night. New Japan dominates. Sean Radican covering that event, has a roundtable review in this week's Torch newsletter, just saying, in the end, ROH didn't gain from this, that it cost them because they looked weak compared to New Japan, and also the crowd response wasn't strong enough to really justify that. Oh, the show the finishes made up for the show. The crowd interaction, the crowd involvement in the match has made up for the fact that ROH lost. So anyway, your thoughts on that, and your kind of main talking points coming out of Friday's anniversary show.
Yeah, I agree with Sean. That was the thing that I took the most from it as well, was that I thought it was a good show. As we talked about beforehand, these shows pretty much always are. It was, a good wrestling up and down, but in terms of the strengths, before I go to the criticism of the show, I in particular, obviously the best match of the show was Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks against ACH and Matt Sydal and Kushida. That was just a really fun spectacle. But beyond that, I really liked what Okada did with Moose. I thought that they had a really fun little match, and I thought that it really made Moose look really, and obviously working with someone like Okada is going to tend to make people look good. But I thought it really was a shine moment for Moose, even in losing clean. And I thought Okada did a really good job with him. And then the Tanahashi Michael Elkin match with the Briscoes, I thought was another really fun match and a highlight of the show. And I think the other sort of highlight for me was the reunion of the Motor City Machine Guns. I think that's a smart move. ROH puts more of an emphasis on tag team wrestling than, arguably any company in the world, quite frankly. They have a really strong tag team division, and that's been a big focus of theirs. And I think bringing in putting the Machine Guns together, neither Shelley nor Sabin was really gaining a lot of traction as singles acts. And I think putting them together puts a lot more value in them together than they had as singles. So I think that's also a smart move. With that said, like Sean points out, the show has the negative of consistently putting both the ROH wrestlers, both the New Japan wrestlers and the New Japan wrestlers over the ROH wrestlers, and the New Japan wrestlers in non-storyline matches felt a lot more important than the matches that the ROH wrestlers were building up with angles, which I think it's something we talked about last week. I think it's something of an indictment of the booking of the show, when the matches on the show that had the most storyline going into them, in often cases, were the matches that were the least over on the show. I think that says you aren't connecting as well as you would like with some of the stories you're telling. I think that with the ROH guys consistently losing in every key match, from Ishii beating Strong and Fish, to Goto beating Castle, to Tanahashi and Elgin beating the Briscoes, to Okada beating Moose, even Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks are more associated with New Japan than with ROH. It really was consistently, the story of the show was the New Japan guys are the real stars, and that's not really the idea I would want to get across to my fan base if I'm ROH. I'd want to be putting over my guys as being superior, or at least on the same level as the New Japan guys. And there's a way to get over even with losing. I mean, when Kenta Kobashi came over and wrestled Samoa Joe, I think that did a lot to elevate Joe, even though he lost the match. But the way it was put together wasn't really... I don't think a lot of the ROH guys came out stronger. It was just like they lost to the New Japan guys who were the real stars, which is a problem.
What's your knowledge or perception of what is going on in terms of the New Japan winning all the matches? I mean, is this just New Japan going, well, if you want us to work with you, all our guys have to go over, or is there something else going on? What? Because it just seems like an anniversary show where all your guys lose is just bad for business, perception-wise.
Well, this is something that's been true for decades, as you well know. If you are a powerful promotion in Japan, which has traditionally meant All Japan or New Japan, they didn't like their guys losing in the United States, and it was why your territory. You did well with it with it, Wade. The AWA, why they were able. Some of the last stars of the promotion were able to get. Were guys like Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen, because they weren't going to go to some of the other territories, because the other territories knew that they weren't going to be losing matches. Vern at that point had lost so much talent that he said, "Hey, I got to get the star power that I can have, even if they're not going to be able to put over my guys at the end, or if I hope that they'll put over my guys in the end, even though they've made it clear the entire time they're not going to do it." And then they run over your belt with a tractor when you try to get them to do it. Yeah, I mean, so that's been a problem for decades, and the reason for it is a pretty obvious one, which is, in the United States, there isn't a lot of mainstream coverage of Japanese pro wrestling. So if one of our guys goes over to Japan and loses in a big match, nobody knows. I mean, a WCW famously, when Vader was their world champion, sent him over to lose to Nobuhiko Takada, and get a big payoff of it, because people really didn't know in the United States that it had happened. Whereas in Japan, it's completely different. In Japan, you've got all of these, and they aren't as strong now, but particularly, years ago, you had these Japanese daily and weekly newspapers that would cover the results from around the world. So if you lost if Stan Hansen lost in America, they would have that result in Japan, and it would make them look like less to the Japanese public. And so the Japanese companies have always been protective of their guys when they're wrestling overseas. Now, and we've seen from the past, when New Japan's brought their guys to the United States, they've been willing to have some of the mid-tier guys lose to ROH guys, but the top guys, Tanahashi, Okada, and Nakamura, they were booked to win, and that was just part of the agreement. And ROH has to know, given that I think they get a lot more from their relationship with New Japan than New Japan does from them, that that's just part of the deal, and they've got to accept that. And it's just the reality of the deal. Now, here, I mean, everything I just said there is more factual. Again, this a little bit more speculation in terms of your question. Why was it booked this way on this individual show? And I would speculate that it has to do with the current landscape in New Japan, which is Nakamura's left, AJ's left, Tanahashi's banged up. There's a lot less clarity about who's going to be the top guys in the company going forward. So I think there are probably more guys right now that they view as important to protect than they did a year ago when they had the established few guys that are the ones that are going to protect. So I think that might have expanded the group of guys that they don't want to be losing overseas and might have limited the options in terms of what ROH could have done.
And maybe, too, it stands out more that the ROH guys are losing, but they're not losing to as deep of a New Japan roster, so maybe the New Japan faithful react a little bit going, hey, wait a second, I don't know. But I think, what you're saying, too, just for sure. I mean, that's what I was looking for, is New Japan, those guys can't afford to just be losing to the U.S. in front of a relative, crowd size doesn't matter, but losing in the United States on an ROH show. This is probably the last situation where New Japan would suddenly volunteer and go, no, let's do what's right for you.
Yeah, and look, it's not like it's a gigantic deal in a lot of senses, because the guys who are watching ROH know these New Japan guys as big stars, and so like I think it's harder to sort of pull the wool over their eyes if you have somebody who's a lesser talent beat someone who's a greater talent. It isn't like the days where that would mean a lot to say, okay, that guy must be better. Now people tend to gravitate towards the guys with the most talent either way. So there is that factor, but I wouldn't have necessarily booked it that way. By the way, one other thing on the show. Did you see the pre-show by any chance?
No.
Did you hear about the Young Bucks promo on the pre-show?
No.
Oh my God. You've got to see this thing,
okay.
Wade. So
I've got it on DVR, so I'm assuming the pre-show is. I hit record on the whole show, but I tuned in at the top of the show.
Oh man, I almost don't even want to spoil it now. They did a Young Bucks promo in the aisleway before the show started, and Nick Jackson is cutting the promo, and he gets flustered in the middle of what he's saying. He pauses, looks at the camera like shell-shocked, like a 7th grader in a play. And Matt very quietly on camera right next to him gives him his line, which he then repeats on camera. It was amazing that this happened. You've got to check it out. I
definitely do.
It was a catastrophe. I don't know that I can't even remember the last time I've seen that, where someone forgot their line and you literally see the person right next to them give them their line audibly on television. It was quite the sight.
Eric Bischoff had a rep for mouthing the words that people were saying in the ring as they were saying them, but I never really believed that Eric knew what they were saying word for word. I thought it was some weird imitation tick or something that he had. But
again, I don't even know if they had scripted lines per se, or he was like lost, and so so Matt just decided to say something, and then he repeated what Matt said. But the line, I forget what the line was exactly, but I mean, he gave him a few lines, and then audibly in front of the camera, and then Nick started repeating them to finish up his line. It was quite the moment.
That's great. Do you recommend people get the replay? I mean, we've had thumbs up scores, but not enthusiastic. Mike McMahon gave it an 8, but otherwise it's been pretty tempered. Yeah,
I would agree. I thought it was a good show, worth checking out. Not worth going out of your way to see.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to wait till the end of part 2 to talk about the USC stuff, because we can make that, because we got some good mailbag questions for part 2. I want to talk either about Cornette's book, if you think it'll be quick, Todd. Otherwise, do the UFC talk now and save the Cornette review for part 2.
Either way is fine.
Let's do UFC. We'll just go out of order. We'll go crazy. We'll go crazy.
We are truly out of control. Man, we're wacky. We're wacky, Wade. Okay, so yeah, so. This weekend's show with the Michael Bisping versus Anderson Silva fight, I thought it was a fun fight, and I was glad to see Michael Bisping get this big win that he'd worked so hard for, and even within the fight worked so hard for. I was in the third round when they had the knee. Yeah. I thought I was really sort of down on I was just sort of down on what had happened. I didn't fault anyone, but I felt bad because I felt like it was going to overshadow the fight in general. With what happened, I thought it was understandable why Michael Bisping would want to get his mouthpiece, because I don't think there was a ton of action when he was looking to get the mouthpiece. I think I think it was sort of, it was just sort of a measured approach. But I think when he was signaling for the mouthpiece, I think Anderson Silva thought, okay, here's my chance to attack because he's looking for his mouthpiece. As opposed to they're in the midst of a heated exchange. Michael Bisping in the middle of this says, look for my mouthpiece. I think the looking for the mouthpiece was what precipitated the action picking up. But I don't fault Michael Bisping for what he was doing. I don't fault Anderson Silva either because, hey, those. I mean, it's not like he was doing anything against the rules. He was taking advantage of an opportunity and looking to capitalize on it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And Herb Dean was doing the best job that he could in this situation of trying to get the mouthpiece to Michael Bisping, but he doesn't want to step in the middle of the action. With that said, with all of them sort of tied up in this, it would have felt unfortunate if the fight was decided by Anderson Silva scoring this thunderous knee in the midst of these controversial circumstances, because I think it would have taken away from the results of the fight. It would have added controversy to the whole thing. So it was sort of nice that it went the other way with Michael Bisping getting the decision because it removed that controversy as sort of being seen as the decider of the fight.
Do you blame Anderson? Is it unsportsmanlike for Anderson Silva? Should you just give the guy a second to grab his freaking mouthpiece?
I don't think so. Okay. I mean, I think it's your responsibility to keep fighting, and when there's a break in the action for the referee to go for it. I think it would have been sportsmanlike if he had backed off and said, "Hey, you get your mouthpiece." But I don't think there was any obligation whatsoever. And we've seen over the years in both boxing and in MMA that some fighters will spit out mouthpieces to essentially get a breather.
Yeah.
So. If you sort of make it be known that you're a fighter that will give people the opportunity to go grab your mouthpiece, you're sort of inviting people to take advantage of you.
If a lady just started screaming hysterically in the crowd, and it was behind Bisping, and he briefly glanced over to see what it was about, and Silva round kicked him in the face and knocked him out or kneed him, would that? No, I'm actually serious here. Would that be unsportsmanlike because it's clearly not looking for an advantage, and hey, you got to concentrate, or would that be something you'd be critical of?
No, if that happened, Michael Bisping would be an idiot, and Anderson Silva would be perfectly justified.
Gotcha. No, that's what I was getting at. I'm kind of seeing, is there a situation where fighters go, hey, wait, something weird's going on out there. I'm not going to let this be why people think I could beat this guy only because there was a distraction in the crowd.
Yes, and if Dolph Ziggler's music hit and he made his way out and he started dancing and thrusting and gyrating, if Michael Bisping turned around to stare at Dolph Ziggler and Anderson Silva grabbed him in a heel hook from behind, Anderson Silva would be justified and Michael Bisping would in fact be a gigantic idiot.
Well,
never believe in again.
The first two times that Bisping asked for his mouthpiece, I was like, stop that. You're going to get knocked out. And then the third time he did. So I'm with you. I mean, I just think you got to fight without a mouthpiece or just be 100.
Easy for you to say. If you don't do a podcast without a mouthpiece, you're not going to get your teeth knocked out.
Well, that's true, but I would rather
unless we do it in person.
I'd rather concentrate on not. Oh God, I almost missed that one. Thinking of my next line here. Man. All right, where was I? I don't even know. Jeez, Todd, that threw me. That threw me off. Let's just move on. Okay, here's another talking point for the fight. I'm sure you have plenty, so don't let me derail also the points you want to make. But is Anderson Silva trying to win with style points, and do you think he could do better if he was just fundamentally more aggressive and more basic in his approach by just being better at the basics? Does that make sense?
I understand the question. I think that throughout his career, Anderson has relied on various antics to lull fighters into making mistakes. And it's worked in lots of instances throughout the years where he'll be playing around and the opponent will make a mistake. He'll move in too quickly. He'll get flustered by it. And then Anderson Silva will counter and cause, and knock the guy out or do something impressive. And that's just part of his natural style, and it's strategic. It's not, I don't think it's meant to just sort of be showboating for the sake of showboating. As well, I shouldn't say never, because I think if you do it as much as Anderson Silva has over the years, there probably are periods where he sort of gets into it to some degree. But I think it's part of a larger strategy, and a strategy that's worked for him. I think that the key distinctions right now, as far as why he might want to back off from doing that a little bit more, are one, his chin isn't what it used to be. And we've seen before that there were periods where you could take the shots and there was no worry whatsoever, and then he'd attack back. And he wouldn't even take that many shots, but if he did, he was able to take it. But we've seen in the past few years that his chin just isn't what it used to be. And there were periods against Michael Bisping where it looked like Michael Bisping was going to have him in real trouble when he landed shots, because Silva just couldn't take a punch like he could before. But I think the bigger deal is actually in his offensive striking, and that he's always had such great reflexes because he's such a great athlete.
Yeah.
And as he's gotten a little bit older, he's slowed a little bit. When he was showboating, so Bisping would attack and then he'd look to counter. And I think in a lot of those instances when he was younger, he would have landed a lot of those counters because his reflexes were just a little bit better. But on Saturday night, a lot of those counters, he wasn't landing them as solidly as he would have liked. But sort of the most famous one, the Forrest Griffin fight, where Forrest Griffin is just swinging wildly and he's dodging everything and then countering. That remains. I was at that show. That remains, to me, the most impressive. Just sort of raw display I've ever seen in MMA.
I almost thought it was cruel because you were seeing like Forrest's self-esteem for anything he had ever accomplished in life just evaporate.
Yeah, he ran out of the cage, and I certainly didn't blame him. Because he's in there with this guy who's a former world champion, and he just toyed with him like a cat and a mouse.
Yep.
Forrest Griffin is swinging wildly, missing everything. Anderson's just bobbing and weaving, and then when he wants to attack, boom, right on the chin. And Michael Bisping's a lot more technical than Forrest Griffin, and he's a better defensive fighter than Forrest Griffin. But I think there might have been a similar dynamic when they were younger as far as his ability to counter effectively, and we didn't see that on Saturday night.
Yeah, no, I actually watched the fight, thought the same thing you did. That I thought that I was impressed that it was still the old Silva in ways that I feared it wouldn't be. Just based on the Diaz fight and what we saw even in the rematch for the title. I just thought that maybe that Anderson Silva wasn't there anymore, and I thought Bisping was a serious enough, credible enough opponent that it would show. And I thought from that showboating, or even the clowning as Joe Rogan called it, I thought it was the old Anderson. He had those reflexes and he had confidence in them. He wasn't going to back away from them based on what had happened. That said, yeah, he wasn't able to then counter, and I don't think that Bisping's not, this 27-year-old. He's got age on him too, so it's not like Bisping's reflexes are so good he was just avoiding Silva. So I was thinking, all right, Silva's still Silva, but he's not Silva in his prime now at age 40 with what he had gone through. But still, that said, I thought he was like 8 out of 10 in terms of what I feared and what I hoped for. I thought he brought 8.5 in terms of the Silva that I just think is the greatest of all time to watch.
Yeah, and I'm not disputing your general feeling that Anderson Silva showed a lot of the qualities we saw in a prime Anderson Silva. It was by no means a sad fight. I wasn't expecting one, though. I thought that he looked pretty solid against Nick Diaz, even if that wasn't a great performance. And I thought this was another solid performance. You can see that you can see the greatness in Anderson Silva, but you can also see that he isn't the fighter he once was. Yeah. And if there's one sort of positive of the result going Bisping's way as far as the decision, it means that we're not going to see that Anderson Silva-Luke Rockhold fight, which I think just would have been an utter and then, well, they still might make it at some point down the line, but I think it would just be an utter massacre, and I'm very glad that fight is not on the way.
Which fight is it on the way? I got distracted very briefly.
How dare you. Anderson Silva versus Luke Rockhold.
Oh, right. Yeah, and actually, I had to clarify because I was going to ask what's next for both fighters as a result of this. And had Anderson won, I was curious what your thoughts were on what that would be from a too tempting for a box office standpoint not to book it, and even if the feeling was Rockhold would be better.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Anderson Silva, they'll just find fun fights for him. I think there's still a lot of interest potentially in Anderson Silva versus George St. Pierre if George St. Pierre wanted to come back for a fight.
Yeah.
And other than that, you just match him against solid middleweights or light heavyweights that he would that make for interesting fights. As far as Bisping, he's sort of in a tricky situation because his fight with Luke Rockhold was really one sided. So if Chris Weidman were to beat Luke Rockhold in their rematch, I think you would want to have Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva, Chris Weidman versus Michael Bisping for the title. I think that's a pretty easy call. If Luke Rockhold retains, I know that Bisping is still probably the bigger money fight, but given how one-sided that fight was, I still think I'd be looking to put Jacare, assuming he wins his next fight, in there against Luke Rockhold instead.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anything else quick on that fight?
Nope.
All right,
Although I got a couple long things.
Thank you, smartass. All right, let's wrap up an abbreviated part one. On that note, we'll come back. We'll talk more about USC in part two, including looking back at Saturday's event, but also looking ahead, and the Cornet book review and reader questions. If you're a VIP member with a question for The Fix with Todd Martin, the email address, and get it in right away, and we might get to it tomorrow, is thefixwithtoddmartin@ This is PWTorch.com editor Wade Keller, along with Torch audio analyst Todd Martin, and this is The Fix with Todd Martin, a special Friday edition on March 4th, 2016. Welcome to The Fix, Todd.
Thanks. My description seems to be perpetually evolving.
It does. What do you want?
I don't care.
That's what I figured.
Hell, if you want it to be derogatory, I don't care.
Actually, I've meant it that way the whole time. All right.
You've been testing different things to see if you can get my dander up, but unfortunately it hasn't worked.
Well, it's been a little while since you ran a column, so I'm like, call you audio analyst. I think that works. And I called you audio host last week, and I got self-conscious. It's like, you're not really hosting, so it's more me just not really thinking about it until I'm doing it and then improvising poorly. Anyway, let's just talk about at least one of the quote breaking news stories today. Not a huge deal, but Brock Lesnar's match for Roadblock a week from tomorrow night has been announced. He's taking on Bray Wyatt. That was, I guess, among the list of potential WrestleMania opponents when people were trying to think of disappointing possible matches for him, but not utterly horribly disappointing matches for him. What do you think about Bray being fed to Brock?
Wow, you really lit that up there. I don't really know what to. I mean, you sort of hit all the bases there. Clearly, originally they were thinking of Undertaker and Brock at one point. Undertaker and Brock and Bray at one point, because the way they were booking them. Not. So at the point that they weren't doing Brock and Bray Wyatt for WrestleMania, it makes sense to do the match to build up this show here out of a Brock appearance rather than doing Luke Harper, which was the original plan, which would have been a sort of a segue to get to Bray Wyatt. But if you're not building towards Bray Wyatt, you might as well just do the bigger match right now. And I figure they'll just put over Brock because they don't seem to have a lot of plans with Bray right now. And I don't see a lot of harm coming from that. Although who knows? I mean, Bray's sort of been teasing something or other, so maybe they're building something and this will offshoot into some sort of other program.
Hayabusa, dead at age 47. A really popular high flyer, ended up paralyzed. There was a dramatic moment. I'm trying to think how long ago it was where he got out of his wheelchair and walked to the ring on his own with a cane. Real sad news. Early reports are a hemorrhaging of some type. Any thoughts on Japanese legend Hayabusa and his career and his death?
Yeah, it's just a sad story. I mean, he's a guy that was very, very distinctive look from early in his career. I remember being aware of him well before I started seeing more of his matches, just because he had the cool name and the cool look. He was in the first WCW video game that they'd done for the N64, which did very well. They had him as a character in there under an assumed name. To sort of play off his popularity in Japan, which is where it was originally designed. Probably his most famous match in the States was the match with Jinsei Shinzaki against Sabu and Rob Van Dam at Heatwave 98, which was a very good match and one of ECW's better shows. That Heatwave show was a real hot show, and that was probably the best match on the show in terms of him standing out and looking good. And yeah, I mean the getting paralyzed in the ring. One of the few wrestlers to have that happen to him, and then he was able to get up and walk again. It was a really nice moment. It was sort of reminiscent of Magnum TA coming out with a cane in the 80s. It's sort of a dramatic, touching moment, but even more so because with Magnum it didn't take him as long to be able to come out with a cane, whereas with Hayabusa, the word years back had been that he wasn't going to be able to walk again, and then he was able to come back a few years back. So it was sort of a nice moment in a life really filled with a lot of tragedy, from the original accident to him passing away now. It's just a sad story because he really was very talented and could have done a lot more, I think.
And age 47, it's just it's just super sad. The Divas title match is now set up. It is a three-way. Sasha and Becky both getting a well-deserved chance at a showcase match against Charlotte. This coming out of what happened last night on SmackDown. Your thoughts on going with a three-way match instead of one-on-one, one way or the other, choosing between Sasha and Becky?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this before, but I really don't like it. I think that you can do a lot more and make it a lot more effective with a one-on-one build. I think sometimes a three-way feud works if you have the right dynamic, But here, I think you really wanted to have a showcase for the women and really have it stand out as being something that puts this is the first WrestleMania they've had since the so-called Divas Revolution. So it's a time to really make the division feel important. And I think the feud and issue being diverted with the different wrestlers in it, I think takes away the passion, some of the passion people would have in it, because there isn't a clear vision of what and there isn't a clear one-on-one focus that I think enhances matches and has been, the case with pretty much all of the best received women's matches they've done in NXT. So I think it's a mistake, but I understand the psychology. I mean, very much over recent years they've booking with the idea of, essentially trying to keep everyone happy. Like all sorts of people will get title runs, they'll have wins traded back and forth. There's very much a lot of the booking is done to sort of keep everyone sort of happy at a certain level. And this fits this after, Becky Lynch had done well for herself and she gets to be in the match as well. But I really think that the match would have worked better if you just had a one-on-one with Sasha Banks and Charlotte, or for that matter, if you had Becky Lynch and Charlotte. I mean, it's I think a feud that sort of run its course, but I still think that would be better than the three-way for what it's worth.
Mick Foley on the PWD Torch livecast yesterday said he was going to volunteer to Vince McMahon, who had told him through an intermediary to stay in touch more. And so as soon as the show was done, he was going to text Vince and offer his services to book and write the women's division. And one of his ideas was to bring to WWE more of an NXT approach of sportsmanship with some disagreements, but not being a little bit more about the spirit of competition and excelling in the ring and that kind of congratulations after a great match approach that NXT has taken, especially Sasha as a heel, coming across as grateful and gracious, probably a better word, after some of her better matches, and taking that approach. What would that? Where do you fall as far as that goes in a large sense, and in particular for the women's division? Does it make sense to book them differently and not go with more of a straight up, here's the heel, let's give you every reason in the world to boo her. Here's a babyface, let's give every reason in the world to cheer, and try to sell matches around that versus what Mick's suggesting, which is more about we're just going to be a great division, great matches, and raise ourselves to new levels.
Well, I would think if you were, and I haven't heard that interview with Mick yet, but I would think that if you were doing that sort of thing, it would accentuate the characters that are cheating a little bit more. So I would think that if you were doing that direction, I would think the idea would be that in general there's more in the way of that sort of sportsmanship or fair play, and that you don't have people going as over the top, but Charlotte would still be functioning as a heel, still less of a likable character than the others. It would just not be as pronounced, and everyone would sort of be. I mean, you could sort of do a more subtle heel character, like you would have in the 70s. Or the early 80s, where you'd have a heel like Dory Funk Jr., who wasn't doing a lot of, or even Jack Briscoe in some territories, where he isn't doing a lot of cheating, he isn't scowling at the fans, but he'll do little subtle things that'll make you dislike him more. Yeah. So I would think you wouldn't be moving away from that entirely if you were going in that direction. But, I mean, I can see the merit in that, particularly with a women's division. I think that I think in women's sports in general, there's been an emphasis on sort of fair play and sort of more just sort of sportsmanship and whatnot. I mean, women's soccer is very much along those lines relative to a lot of say like men's football and men's basketball, where there's a lot more fist bumping and fist pumping and celebrations and sort of over the top histrionics that I think plays differently to different audiences. So I can see the merit in that. I've never been a huge fan of the ROH approach where you make it a point of saying that we are about, we're about handshakes and about fair play. And I just think it sort of feels quaint and, I don't know, uncool. But I think you can have that atmosphere without bringing attention to it, where you've got more realistic characters, you've got people that are not doing a lot of sort of silly heel mannerisms or acting, insulting the local sports team in a way that just sort of brings attention to yourself as, oh, I'm playing the bad guy. You play it more straight. You don't say you don't make a point of telling people that, because I think it again, I think it just sort of feels uncool. But if you put forward that atmosphere, I think it can play well. So I'm trying to address it, but
Yeah.
not having heard what Mick said in its entirety yet, it's harder for me to know if I'm hitting exactly what he was getting at.
Sure, no, but I think the way I interpreted it, and hopefully did a decent job repeating it, I think you addressed it pretty well. But when you hear the interview, you can let me know if I failed to convey Mick's point of view the way you saw it, and if you want to augment or add anything to it, as long as you're nice about it.
Nice to you, or nice to Mick?
Either way, both are good.
Because I figured if it was nice to you but mean to Mick, you'd potentially be more receptive.
Oh, probably. I mean, I'm a human being. The interview, by the way, is a good one. If we have any fixed fanatics out there who don't get around to the live cast interviews necessarily, definitely recommend. I recommend Jim Ross last week and Mick this week. He spent 2 hours with us, took a lot of good calls, good mix of nostalgia, and a good discussion on concussions. And he mentioned that every year, because Kevin Nash made the news this week, saying, revealing that he had agreed to donate his brain and spinal cord to CTE research. And Mick reacted to that. I don't think he had heard, and got a little emotional, just like, wow, that's a big deal. And he said it's a big deal for him. Every year he renews that pledge. Like, that's something you actually have to reaffirm annually. And he said it's a hard thing to do. You think about your mortality and the implications of it and stuff. But I asked him about, what moves he would want left out of the repertoire of moves that are very common in wrestling. And he mentioned a few things, but
Nesty bumps off the apron. Nesty plunges off the apron.
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the more, obviously it's one of the more obvious ones. I mean, you're right to laugh at it because it's obvious, and he was the extreme version of that. But he brought up, like, he was talking about forearm blows, and that he had texted Adam Rose about forearms to the head, and then German suplex, as he said, he's not comfortable with those, and got into some good detail on that. And I asked if what Shane McMahon does at WrestleMania might bother him, because there's going to be pressure on Shane, or self-imposed or otherwise, to, as he said, try to earn the respect of his father by jumping off of big things, I guess. And Mick just said, and it's a good point. It's one of the reasons I'm critical of what Shane does in the ring, and the latitude that he's given, is that Mick said, well, if he does it and gets hurt, it's just one move. He doesn't have to go back on the road right afterwards. He said the problem with him and many others is you'd get a concussion and you would just keep wrestling, week after week, weekend after weekend, and didn't give your body proper time to recover. I don't think he was trying to be callous about Shane getting hurt, but I think that's underlines a point that I've made about where Shane kind of sets the bar so high as a civilian, in essence, going in the ring and getting to go balls out in a way that other wrestlers then who are in that realm of big stunt wrestlers, or just those trying to dive through the ropes and get a pop, and they pale compared to Shane, but Shane can afford to do it. And I didn't prompt Mick at all on it, other than asking him the question about how I felt about watching Shane, knowing that he had done similar big stunts as Shane, and he just said, well, with Shane it's different because he doesn't have to get back in the ring right away.
There you go. Always bring it back to attacking poor Shane. Poor Shane. Just man, one after another. But no, as far as like the general point, one thing I will say about that is that I think over time there has been. It's pretty damn clear. There has been at least improvement in regards to what you were talking about, which is people taking serious injuries, whether it's injuries to the body or to the head, and then just continuing on. Because, there was very much a mentality in all sports of just sort of continuing on, and now there's a lot more awareness of it. And there you can still say there can be improvements to be made. You look at the way that they've treated some guys that have had head injuries, with Dolph Ziggler and Wade Barrett coming to mind, where they sort of seem to hold it against them and punish them for taking time off for head injuries. And that sends a bad message to the rest of the roster as far as working through that stuff or taking your time off like you'd need. With that said, it's certainly a lot better than it was during Mick's time. And I think over time we're going to see the fruits of that improved philosophy towards it, just like we've seen an improvement in the injury rates when they took away a lot of the really high impact neck moves a number of years back.
Absolutely. Yep. So anyway, everybody go check that out. Let's talk about what happened on Impact on Tuesday night, Todd. We had the long hyped Kurt Angle, Bobby Roode match. Went just under 9 minutes. What'd you think of the way it was presented and the length of it and that this match and how it fits into kind of the farewell tour, as they're calling it, for Angle.
I didn't think about the time when I was watching it. Maybe because it was at the beginning of the show, but it didn't feel like it was truncated. So that was, I think, a good thing because you don't want to have that feel. And I thought it was a very good match. I thought it was interesting the way they did it. I mean, in a lot of instances, if you've got someone on the way out, the mentality would be beat them with your various different guys since they're leaving. And here, obviously they've got a lot of plans for Bobby Roode. He's one of their top guys, and they had him put over Angle in his second to last match. And afterwards they still made it about Angle. They had beer money sort of putting over Angle, and it was a nice moment for him. And I can sort of see both arguments. On the one side, I mean, I do see the traditional argument that if he's your guy, he's going to be sticking around. You would want him to go over somebody that's leaving. But I also think there's something to be said for making someone feel special. So when you do the big angle that's designed to get someone over at the expense of the person, or have that person putting over someone, then it has more currency because you're protecting them to some degree. I think that's the point that WWE has missed in recent years. A lot of legends have sort of been weakened over time because WWE just beat them and beat them and beat them. And if they let them get in a win here and there, they'd have more value. And then when they lost, it would be a big deal. With Mick Foley being a good example of that, Chris Jericho being another example of that. But they've done that with a lot of guys. And so I guess on balance, I kind of would prefer the TNA approach of giving them some wins so you feel good about them. You feel like they have value coming out, but then if they lose, it feels like it's a bigger deal than it would be if they were just sort of the designated jobber.
I've seen Jericho on Twitter, and I think on his podcast too. Just say he can't win. If he doesn't put other guys over, then people complain to him about having an ego and not giving back. But then when he does jobs, people go, well, you're not living up to your star power, and you're diminishing your value and that kind of thing. And I know he gets kind of frustrated when in that he can't win either way. I mean, I think it's all contextual. If a loss really means something and it's to the right person, if Jericho loses and it's the right person and it boosts their career, that's great. But if Jericho loses to the wrong person or the right person without the proper build-up, context, and follow-up, it's a bad move.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a case-by-case basis. And I can understand his frustration because, it does. I can imagine him thinking, geez, I sort of get attacked either way. But, and I'm, I'm a part of that, in terms of attacking him on both sides for the reasons you mentioned, that it's context about individual feuds. I don't think that he should have been. I spoke vehemently against him losing to Fandango during that feud because my thought was it was a limited character. It didn't have a lot of value. And
boy, were you proven wrong, Todd. I mean, I'm surprised you even bring that up.
Yes, it isn't the sort of thing I'd bring up to feel good about myself versus the people that were vehemently arguing the other way at the time. Right. But but then on the flip side, I was very much against him defeating AJ Styles, even in the middle part of their feud, because I thought there was much more upside to AJ Styles than there was to Fandango. Although really, all of this is something of a moot point because Jericho's devaluing was years and years ago. Yeah. At this point, there's still value in him, like a lot of guys on the roster, as somebody that people like, that people get invested in the feuds more than just the average guy. But there was a number of years ago after the Shawn Michaels feud where he felt like a real top guy, and you could use him to get guys over to a higher level because it really established credibility to them. Same thing with Mick Foley for a while, but neither of those guys at this point in time, because another example is Roddy Piper, in the way he was presented. They not necessarily wrestling, but in terms of getting into little issues with people here and there, they presented him so weakly that over time it just didn't have the same feeling of specialness that it once did. And that, that's not a knock on any of those guys. All three of them are legendary performers, but it speaks to the importance of protecting people, even if you're even if your idea is to get them over, you need to protect them along the way. I mean, it's a similar thing to Roman Reigns, where people say, oh, they've invested all of this time in him, they can't turn him heel, and it's like turning him heel is the best thing for him and for your goal of getting him over as a babyface. Same thing with those guys. If your goal is to use them to put over other people, having them win at the right points is important to that goal.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons, going back to TNA, that Rude lost here too is he's in beer money, and I think there's a tendency for bookers to go, well, even a prominent featured wrestler losing to somebody. I mean, this is a little too micro-specific, but in Rude's case, a featured top talent on the roster, but if he's in tag matches, he can afford to lose, whereas if he was a singles wrestler in the world title hunt, you wouldn't want him to lose one-on-one in less than 10 minutes to a legend. I think they probably felt like, for the larger purpose of the angle story they're telling, and Rude being in a tag team, they're not really losing much.
I very much think that was the mentality too. And I don't think that that should be, although it usually is, tag team specific, in the sense that I think that one way you could build up your tag team division is when you have the tag teams wrestling against singles wrestlers, the tag teams tend to win because they're tag team wrestlers. You know, they're used to working together. They know how to team together. They know the intricacies of tag team wrestling, and so they have the advantage. And so if you wrestle one of the top tag teams against a pair of singles wrestlers who may be, the high singles wrestlers on the card, the tag team wrestlers win because they exploit the advantage they have in the tag team wrestling. It shouldn't, if you do that on the regular basis, it shouldn't weaken the singles wrestlers at all, but it very much helps the tag team wrestlers compared to just having the singles wrestlers squash the tag team wrestlers, because tag team wrestlers are peripheral characters.
There's Big Angle later on, or I don't know, I shouldn't say Big Angle, big segment setting up the main event. Matt Hardy, Rockstar Spud, Tyrus, EC3. What'd you think of the latest chapter in this?
I mean, it was basically the Spud heel turn explanation, and I thought he did a good job. I thought that there are a lot of things working against them in that they're in the UK, where Spud is a native of and he's very popular. Number two, they've made Spud very likable in the past year and a half or so. I thought he was really working well as a babyface, and I wouldn't have turned him heel for that purpose, by the way. For that reason, rather, by the way. And number three is that he has a legitimate beef against EC3 and a reason for him to be against him. So he had all those factors working against him. So it was imperative that he really do a lot to make people dislike him. And I thought he did a good job of that. I thought he was very unlikable as a heel in a way that made you want to see EC3 get his hands on it. And actually, to add one more to the 3 points I made before, and a fourth, he's a lot smaller than EC3. So there's sort of a bully dynamic to him going after there. So even though there are a lot of factors working against it there, I think that they did a good job, or as good a job as you could expect, of getting Spud into that role that they're trying to create for him right now.
One thing that I continue to like about Matt Hardy is the very traditional heel promo. He's such a student of the game. I mean, he's obviously went through some very dark times and made some really, really bad decisions. Isolating to today and what he's doing in the ring, and what the booking team is coming up with him too. And when he was on the live cast, we said he's got input on his character, but the writing team is contributing too. I just love, and it sounds so rudimentary and basic that I think some people think, well, that's boring. We have to reinvent the wheel and we have to do things that are crazy and never been done before. I just think pro wrestling it's so efficient to see. Efficient's a key word with what TNA's doing with a relatively small group of wrestlers on these TV shows. In just lines like Matt Hardy saying, I gave EC3 the mandatory rematch, and I will never wrestle EC3 again. He will never get a shot at this world title again. He's on the outside forever. I mean, that's you just now as a viewer, you're like, I can't wait for EC3 to fight Matt Hardy again. How will it happen? I want to see it happen. TNA this year, I'd say more so than even last year, although last year on the Destination America era was a step in the right direction. They're respecting the fundamentals and letting the wrestlers and their personalities, rather than overwritten material and overly clever material, be what drives the segments and the storylines. And I think they're giving. I mean, it's not showing up in the ratings, obviously. I mean, the move to pop has been damaging, but I think from just kind of a fan response, critical acclaim response, I think TNA is getting the recognition and respect that it deserves for stripping away a lot of the nonsense and going back to some of the fundamentals that I think are timeless and at the core of what makes pro wrestling work.
And whether they are or they aren't, at least they're presenting a much better show. So that's always a positive, yes. Even if they're not getting credit for it. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of too many wrestling angles where a heel told a babyface, "You're never going to get this," and then the babyface was going to fight and get that goal, where that wasn't an effective setup. I mean, that's just basic pro wrestling, but that's just basic storytelling, and I think it pretty much always works. And I don't think. Yeah, I think it's I think it's always good.
Any thoughts on update on the Miracle, Mike Bennett and his act with Maria, and the feud with Drew Galloway as a way to further establish Bennett's character?
I didn't have a particularly strong impression one way or another. I feel sort of similarly to how did before,
Yeah.
which is that I don't feel like Mike Bennett is fully clicking in the role that they have planned for him. But it's not like they have a ton of alternatives right now in terms of their roster, so they're making a go of it, and we'll see. Maybe over time it will take more. There have definitely been times over the years when I've been bearish on a new character, and over time they really clicked. I mean, this is sort of a random example that comes to my head, but I thought Bradshaw, who they tried to push for years and years and years, was never. Well, I mean, he was okay. He was good in the APA for what they were. I thought it was it was an entertaining sort of badass babyface tag team. I thought that was effective, but in terms of like giving him singles pushes, I don't think he ever was really clicking as either a heel or a babyface for years and years and years. But then they gave him that JBL gimmick, and at first I was down. I was like, why don't they use someone else in this role? Because I had my preconceptions about him, but I thought over time, and this actually speaks to the TNA thing because it was a disaster from a business standpoint. I mean, it was one of the worst years that they've had from a drawing standpoint with JBL as a champion. But I thought, as far as him being an effective character, I thought he really fit in that role and really became an excellent character and the best work of his career. So just to say, sometimes sometimes people can take off over time and it is instantaneous.
I think it's an example. Well, to a degree, it's an example of numbers not always telling the full story when you decide, who's the best drawing champion, who's the worst drawing champion. Sometimes it's subjective, and there's an eyeball test, and you can look at JBL and go, well, he certainly. I mean, it's not like he was cheated out of being a great draw by terrible booking and a terrible show. It's not like he would have been this breakout act, but I think he was good enough at what he did that you have to look elsewhere for blame and look at the circumstances surrounding him for why things didn't go well during that time.
Yeah, and I also think you can put blame on him as well. I think it was a combination of things. I don't think I think sometimes you can have someone that's a very good performer doing a very good job, and the crowd just isn't reacting to them for one other, and that's just the way it goes sometimes. Sometimes people don't click with the audience like you'd like.
I think anytime somebody's on top and they're not drawing, they get some of the blame. But I think that it is it's a scale, and you can look at everything should have been all the pieces were in place and they just failed to draw, and they failed to catch on versus they weren't able to overcome bad booking like some other people have. And so they have some blame for that. I mean, there's just a whole range. I think answers are complicated when you try to decide who's a good drawing lead babyface or lead heel, or who's the best drawing champion of all time. There's the straight up plug numbers in, spit it out on the ticker tape on the other side of the machine, and you have your metrics. But then there's the human expert analyst aspect that's subjective, and different people can agree to disagree on the percentage of blame that goes to somebody, but understanding they were maybe not the biggest part of the problem, but they weren't good enough to overcome some of the other weaknesses. So yeah, it's just he's an example of somebody where you look and you don't go, well, this is just horrible and boring, but it wasn't enough to overcome whatever else was going on.
Yeah, I mean, there were combination factors. Like, he'd been presented weak for a while. The babyface roster wasn't that strong. They've lost a lot of stars. There were a lot of things going on, but that was one factor. And as far as like your generalized point about drawing and whatnot, it becomes even more tricky as time goes on because WWE is so much of an ensemble brand at this point that traditional drawing cards really don't exist to any large degree. Really, I mean, Cena being really one of the only exceptions, with the occasional feud here or there.
Yeah.
And it just makes it very difficult because you were talking about the numbers and whatnot, and it reminded me of Dave Meltzer in The Observer at the end of the year. He'll do these things where he sort of tabulates all-time draws, where it's like he's got some sort of formula that he plugs in based on house show attendance over decades, and he's trying to compensate for the fact that he doesn't have numbers here, he has numbers here. There are different periods, but it's trying to be a balanced approach to who have been the best draws over time. And when you look at the people from 1930s, from the Londos era through the 1990s, where you're looking at still guys like Hogan and Austin and Rock. There's, I think, a very strong correlation between who the biggest draws are on the list and who the biggest draws are on this list that he's created. But then he also has guys past that period, because you can't just cut off wrestling at some point. So there are guys from the modern, the modern recent era of the last 15 to 20 years, and those just do not fit to me. There are guys that'll be on this list. You'll have Big Show and Kane and Edge and various guys who, whether they're good performers, bad performers, indifferent, they really weren't draws to any real sense. They just happened to be in the main events of the cards of WWE shows at that given time. And it's not like years ago where the hook was, okay, we've got Strangler Lewis is going to be on the top of the card. And people say, ooh, Strangler Lewis against some person here. I'm going to go see this card. Or, ooh, look, Ric Flair's on top of this card. I'm going to go see this. Now it's, oh, WWE's coming to town. I will go and see this WWE crowd. And it happens to be, Big Show versus John Cena as your main event. It really has very little to do, nothing to do with Big Show. Or, if you have, Edge versus Big Show is a better example, because Cena to some degree is a draw. And so you get these numbers, and it's an attempt to quantify who the biggest draws are, but I just don't think it works like it used to, because it has become so much of an ensemble deal for WWE.
Yeah, sometimes it's like trying to judge it's analogous to trying to decide what the fastest car is when some are driving in mud and some are driving on pavement and some are driving on dirt and some in the winter and some in the summer, and that's the only data you have.
Sorry, I just said tennis because that sort of fits into the.
Oh yeah, okay, good, yes.
Because you've got different courts, people say it's very different. The French Open when you've got clay versus grass or other surfaces.
Yeah, or just era to era. Looking at basketball numbers, and some stats weren't kept, and it's just circumstance. I agree. I mean, it's too broad of a space. I think it's an exercise worth doing, but with just giant asterisks that have to be taken into account due to the subjectivity and changing circumstances that you just ran down in detail.
And it's really changed recently. Like that was what I was trying to get at. Is like I think it actually worked pretty darn well. Like I mean, for years and years. I mean, it's very difficult to compare, Luthez as a drawing card versus Jack Briscoe. But you can look at the places they went, the number of times they headline, and sort of get a feel comparing them against each other. But with the last 15, 20 years of WWE, it really is just sort of circumstance of who happens to be put. Randy Orton's another example of what I was talking about, where who happens to be put on top of these various cards. And if you happen to put Randy Orton on top of a bunch of these cards rather than the Big Show, then his numbers are going to be better. But it really doesn't tell you anything about those two guys, and it certainly doesn't say that Randy Orton, if he's headlined a bunch of these cards for WWE in the last few years, is anything resembling a drawing card compared to a Terry Funk. Not that I'm not knocking Randy Orton, but Terry Funk was actually relied on as a drawing card. You'd put him on the marquee, and people would come to see Terry Funk. And Randy Orton, there have been precious few times where that was the dynamic with Randy Orton.
And I think, it's by design. I mean, WWE wanted to take the power away from the wrestlers, have at most one or two guys that could claim to be draws, and just mitigate it and turn it into a bunch of interchangeable pieces in a brand in order to reduce headaches and reduce payroll and gain more power.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. I was going to add one of I feel kind of the same way about biggest draws during the Monday Night War era in quarter hours, because there were people in power who would put themselves in positions that they knew would draw better. They would have a segment right after a segment that involved. There might be a mid-card wrestler who moved the ratings, or a semi-main event guy who held ratings, and they would position their segment at the top of the hour right after that wrestler, and with minimal commercial interruptions leading up to it. And somebody who wasn't in political favor would be in a less advantageous position after a wrestler who they're obligated to put on the show but doesn't draw, and it'd be loaded with commercials, and then they would inherit a smaller audience, and then that can work against them. And that's just one of many, many flaws in trying to decide who was the biggest ratings draw. I think you have to kind of go, all right, here's when someone's at the top of the second hour. Here's when someone's at the top of a hour or top of the show. You can narrow it down to apples a little bit better that way.
Yes, although I will say that what you're talking about here is essentially, and it absolutely happened, is cheating on the margins. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to manipulate the numbers in a way that tells you a story that may not be entirely accurate. So you compensate for that, but the reason that you are trying to manipulate is there is something to manipulate, which is that some people were better draws than other people during that period. Yep. And that's the same thing with the draws. Like you can compensate for, say, Bob Backlund's a great example. Bob Backlund, during the period that he was on top, WWF got into the habit of loading up the cards very frequently because of the feeling that Bob Backlund on his own wouldn't necessarily be able to draw full crowds to some of the biggest cities. So they'd have Andre the Giant on the card, they have these other people on the card, and you would want to take that into account when you're comparing Bob Backlund as a drawing card versus Bruno Sammartino as a drawing card. When Bruno Sammartino frequently, they'd say, we got Bruno, we don't need anyone else on the card. Just throw a bunch of bums in there because Bruno will draw on his own on the top. And so that there you're trying to tinker to figure out who the biggest draws are, because there's a fundamental core there of truth, just like with the ratings. But with some of these more recent years of WWE, there really isn't much of a fundamental truth as far as who the biggest drawing cards are. It really is just the happenstance of who they happen to headline on this event, and you can get nominal variations depending on who the people are on top. But there really isn't a big core where if you say we're going to put Seth Rollins versus Dean Ambrose on this card versus what's an example here, versus Kevin Owens versus Chris Jericho. There's really, it's people aren't going to be considering one versus the other. It's really just WWE's coming to town. Okay, we've got this card. John Cena is a bit of an exception, I think, with some people, but I think that's overstated. And even a guy like Roman Reigns, who they're pushing a lot, I don't think there are a lot of people out there who are saying, "Ooh, Roman Reigns is on the card. I'm going to go to this show," even though they actually do protect him more than they do pretty much anyone else on the roster.
I think you can compensate for that somewhat if WWE decided, for any number of reasons or contexts, to run every month in the same market, month after month, in the same building. Because then I think you would get a month-to-month variation. Oh, they got something going here. They've got a month-to-month feud going with these two guys, and the crowds were up 25% from where they were on average. The 4 shows before that were on to something. Or, we brought AJ in, AJ Styles in, headlined with him, that led to a pop. And then the next month, AJ was not available for the show for some reason. We headlined with Roman, and there was a drop. Or vice versa. But then you have enough of a sample size as opposed to the novelty of, one of 2 or 3 times WWE's in town. It's a house show. I'm going to go or not go to a house show because my last house show experience was either fun or not fun.
And that's one of the frustrating things about what they do, because I love to know those sorts of things, and WWE doesn't book in a way that you get to find out those answers.
Right.
I really wish you had that traditional booking where when you brought in a new guy who you thought you had a lot of potential in, you gave them win, you put them in the main event mix, and then you saw what sort of effect does this have on business. And you're right to bring up past periods, because this is exactly what they do. For all this bullshit that Vince McMahon will talk about needing time to establish people, in pretty much every territory, it was you brought in a guy, you pushed him really hard, and he was headlining in a very short period of time.
That's right.
Because that's just logical storytelling. You present this big deal, and the longer you put them in there, just sort of trading wins back and forth with random people, the less special they feel. So you bring them in from the very beginning, and you see how they draw. And if someone draws particularly well, like we're going to talk later about the Jim Cornette book, Jerry Lawler being a prime example. You bring in Jerry Lawler comes in as a heel tag team in the Louisville territory, and he draws well. And so they say, hey, we got something with him. Let's keep booking him in prominent positions. And over time, Jerry Lawler turns out to be one of the best drawing cards in the history of the region. And if you're booking that way, you bring these people in, you present them big, sometimes you're going to be right, sometimes you're going to be wrong. Vince McMahon, as evidenced by Roman Reigns, he needs to be right. So, you just push someone forever, and eventually you hope that you're right. But I think a more confident and secure booker says, I don't know who the fans are necessarily going to take to. So whenever I have someone that has some potential, I'm going to bring them in. I'm going to give them a bunch of wins. I'm going to put them in a prominent position, and I'm going to see how they do. And from that, it's the old thing about steel making steel. Where you've got people to the test. You put them in that position, and you compare them to the other people put in that position, and you see how well they do. And the people that don't do as well fall by the wayside. The people that do better, you keep pushing them in that way. And over time, you get a much stronger, healthier business, and you get much more measurements in terms of who's doing well and who isn't.
Absolutely. I'd love to see WWE figure out a way to do that, but then again, I think they don't want those metrics in a way. There's a few people they selectively hype ahead of time when they're in a match. It'd be even within Raw if they made a bigger deal and planned more ahead and built shows around specific matches more often and let you know when the match was happening and built up to it. There might be some more movement within those minute by minute and hour by hours than there are now, which is instead, just kind of tune in and eventually we'll get to something you like, and there'll be a lot of filler.
I don't know if I agree with that point, Wade. I think that you can have a negligible difference in terms of hyping things up, but the key is, and this is the point I made with you a number of years back, you have to have something that's worth hyping. You know, the UFC example. You can hype the hell out of an individual card, but if you've got a card people don't want to see, it only is going to have a limited effect. And if you've got this 50-50 booking where people are trading wins back and forth, they're not being presented as special, you can advertise ahead of time the time you want, but I think you're only going to have a limited effect. The key to the whole thing is you need to present people as being special, and the key to making people special, in my opinion, is having them win matches and having them look strong in promos and giving them ways to make them feel special from other people. Having them advertise in advance, I think, can have some effect, but I don't think it's going to have very much if you don't have those core issues settled.
And I don't disagree with you on that. I think it's easy and better to advertise ahead of time stuff because I think it creates the impression that if it's worth mentioning, maybe it is special, and I think that can have an effect that's more than negligible. But I think exponentially more effect. There would be exponentially more effect if, say, AJ Styles came in, wins spectacularly against an increasing level of competition. Kevin Owens is asked about AJ. And is going through a pretty hot streak of his own, and every time AJ's name is mentioned, he reacts in a certain way that builds anticipation, and in the 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th week of AJ's run, you announce this match is going to happen, and it's going to happen on Raw or SmackDown, and it's going to be our main event, but you announce it 2 weeks ahead of time and really build it up. Well, there's a way to test, hey, can we get more than average for a main event out of two guys who have been booked as special, including a hot new act, and WWE doesn't do that.
And it's a crying shame because wrestling would be so much better if they did that.
Oh, I know.
Man.
It's an accelerated version of Conor McGregor, an accelerated version of John Jones, an accelerated version going way back of all the big stars who have ended up. It's a accelerated version of Junior Dos Santos. I mean, it's seeing a guy come in who's new. He wins against not even a gatekeeper, just somebody else, an unknown or a lower guy, and he does so impressively, moves up, then he gets to the gatekeeper stage, he wins there, and now fans start fantasizing about him facing the top established guy because it's an unknown how good this guy is. But when you do the even Steven 50-50 booking for months, it's no longer an unknown. He's just another guy in the crowd, and that just it rounds out all the rough edges, and they just become a blob in the brand.
Yeah, and it doesn't take long. You know, Conor McGregor has 7 UFC fights. Ronda Rousey has 7 UFC fights.
You know, it's not crazy.
It's not like these people have done tons and tons of fights to establish who they are. It was they made people take notice from the very beginning.
And that's all. I mean, TNA, I think, could have done a better job definitely could have done a better job with Trevor Lee in this regard. If they decided, hey, this guy's special, let's do something with him. And I'm not super critical of what they've done with him so far, but I think the notion of having him come in, and you have to have that structure there where, the announcing has credibility and does a good job. Mauro Ranallo or Jim Ross calling early Trevor Lee matches, and he's beating a guy who you didn't know if he'd win or not because you didn't know who he was. And the next week he beat somebody who's been around a while. The next week he beat somebody else. You take a week off and you reflect on it, and then you announce a match that's against a gatekeeper. I mean, yeah, you could accelerate 3 years of UFC fights with a new guy. Pick Trevor Lee or AJ Styles or anybody. Kevin Owens initially, or Baron Corbin when he gets brought up, or Sami Zayn. And you do it, but you do it over. You do what happened to Conor and Ronda over the course of 8 to 12 weeks. As opposed to having to take a few years, like happens with UFC a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else from Impact?
No, although I didn't mention this yesterday, so I'll just make one quick note from SmackDown that I'd forgotten about, but I was reminded for some reason while we were talking, which was that Mauro was so good on SmackDown yesterday. My God, he was so good. I mean, we've talked about this before, and I've been sort of like, yeah, I think Mauro's been pretty good, but I wasn't sort of bubbling over necessarily compared to some people, maybe because I've just heard so much of him commenting various things. But when he was calling the Dean Ambrose versus Kevin Owens match yesterday, he really elevated that match. I thought watching that SmackDown note, it was just beating over the head. This guy really should be calling the big matches immediately. They shouldn't be waiting. He should be the main play-by-play guy for WrestleMania this year. I mean, he's so much better than the other people have, and he elevates the product even on SmackDown, which is such a B show. You put him on the A show, you put him on the A events. I think it really adds another dimension to the show.
He's been better than I thought he would be, and I thought he'd be very good. I think he has moved quickly into the category of he's so good they do need to put politics aside and elevate him. And Michael Cole should be. It's easy for us to say, but gracious about it and acknowledge the obvious. And I'm hoping that Morrow is the announcer for Roadblock. I mean, I think that's a way to introduce him to the audience or to give him exposure in a live show, big show setting that might make that case even more clear than a pre-taped TV show format.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Although I like your idea of just having him call WrestleMania too, but
well, they're not mutually exclusive.
Right, that's exactly right. Okay, how about NXT? You mentioned that you had Austin Aries debuted. It was a big week in that regard. And what do you want to talk about regarding this week's NXT and NXT in general?
Well, since you brought it up, the Austin Aries thing was interesting because there's sort of a question about how much knowledge the people who are watching the NXT show on WWE Network have of the indie scene, of the international scene, etc.
Yeah.
And it seemed pretty clear, unless they're trying to bury the guy, which I don't think they are. It seemed pretty clear that they assumed that the people that are watching that show know a lot about the indie scene and the international scene based on the way they did Aries, because they had Aries come out and they didn't. William Regal just sort of introduced, we got a new guy, and they flash the lights, and he comes out. And it's just the announcer. There's no explanation as to who he is beyond the announcers just being excited and saying, it's the greatest man who ever lived, Austin Aries. There was very much an assumption that the people watching would know who he was. And then Aries was immediately jumped by Baron Corbin and beat up. And I thought it worked. Perfectly fine if you were a big wrestling fan, because you're like, ooh, Austin Aries is here. Oh, and that damn Baron Corbin comes out and ruins his debut. What a jerk. I want to see that match. But on the flip side, if you're someone who's more casual and you don't know who these people are, then he's just this little guy who comes out with no real introduction, and Baron Corbin attacks him from behind and beats him up. It's like, who's this guy and why should I care about him? And I think that with Raw, if you had that sort of thing, I would think, okay, they're just trying to bury the guy because they have a history of trying to bury people. But with NXT, they don't really have a history of burying people. So I read it as saying that WWE, the people who are creating NXT anyway, evidently feel that they have a ton of their audience is primarily hardcore wrestling fans who know who these people are, and thus you would present it that way, as opposed to you've got a lot of casual fans mixed in, and you would want to have a more gradual introduction where you're really sort of establishing who this person is. And I don't know if I don't know empirically whether they're right or wrong about that, but I thought it was interesting. It was an interesting tell about their thoughts on that question.
How about the Neville match with Finn Balor and just the idea of bringing Neville back in this context?
I thought it was a good match. It was straightforward. They didn't go nuts. It wasn't designed to be like this, all-time classic match. And they put Finn Balor over strong. It was well worked. I think the way that they did it sort of suggested a recognition of the damage that they've done to Neville on the main roster, because when he left NXT, he was one of their biggest stars and really very comparable to Finn Balor in a lot of ways. I think there's more star potential in Finn Balor because I think he's got more charisma. Neither of them are particularly good. They're very similar. They're very good wrestlers. They both can high fly well. They have a personal charisma about them, Balor more than Neville, but they do have a personality there. Neither of them are particularly good talkers. And Neville went up there and they really weakened him. So when you came back here, they didn't present it as like, oh, here are the two big guys. It really was Balor beating Neville, which I think should have been the right way to do it, given the damage they have done to Neville.
All right, should we move to the Jim Cornette book review?
One more thing actually before we do that, and
Yeah.
that's that just for NXT, Emma is really effective as a heel right now. Like I think they should bring her back up at this point. They've damaged her as well from her time on the main roster, but it's been long enough. She's a different enough character than she was when she was up there before, and she's so much better than much of the main roster women that I think it would definitely add in a positive way if they brought her back up. And she's earned it. She's worked really hard, and she's dug herself from quite a hole that
Yeah.
that I was going to say that they created for her, but I think she also deserves responsibility. I mean, not that like I mean, they created that character together, and it was a very limited character, and the yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know who's most to blame, but whoever's to blame, they've dug out of the hole.
Very good. All right. Well, let's go ahead and was there one other thing I was going to? No. There isn't. We covered it. Okay. Yeah. I want to hear what you thought of Jim Cornette's book.
Yeah, it's Tuesday Night at the Gardens by Jim Cornette and Mark James. So we should give Mark James his credit too. I know I didn't earlier. He's done a lot of wrestling historical books and worked together with Cornette on this one. And it's follow-ups to Rags, Paper, and Pins and the Midnight Express 25th Anniversary Scrapbook, which were presented in sort of a similar manner, large pages, lots of pictures of various scenes from the past, and both great collections of similar content with photos, programs, tickets, memorabilia, text, and so on. This one's on pro wrestling in Louisville, particularly from, as I alluded to before, particularly from 1970 to 1975, which wasn't the most famous territory, but meant a lot to Cornette because that's where he was growing up. And I do wish there were more historians like this putting together collections on various territories that go well beyond just match results, because there are a lot of those sort of record keeping things, but try to give you context about the territory, have old pictures and various things to sort of give you a real feel for a flair for what the territory was like, more so than just sort of lists of names on a page.
George Shire went a pretty good distance in that direction with his Minnesota Wrestling History book covering the AWA. I know we got some people that like that he wrote a little kayfabe in terms of recounting the storylines, but you got a sense of the ebb and flow of the AWA territory, pretty singularly focused.
Okay, I actually hadn't heard that. I'll need to check that one out too.
Yeah.
Clearly, this one's a labor of love, and Cornette says as much, as he's a big wrestling fan, as is Mark James. But
can I just throw in Chad quick thing so I don't forget? Mark James was on with Jim Valley on February 13th on the Saturday Morning Wrestling Livecast for 100 minutes, talking about the history of Memphis wrestling and surrounding areas, obviously. So people can check that out too. Since you're putting him over, you can actually hear him, and it's available on the audio feed.
There you go. Nice. Cool. So there's the limitation, though, of the book is that Louisville just wasn't as interesting of a city for wrestling as a lot of cities. It meant a lot to Cornette because that's where he was. But for fans who weren't there, you get stories and feuds with far fewer big names than you'd get in, say, St. Louis or New Orleans or Philadelphia. Plus, there wasn't as much in terms of the rotation of talent, so it did tend to be the same guys over and over again, year in and year out, with people mixed in. It's striking how they were able to draw, just coming back over and over again with variations on the same guys, because they're running shows so frequently, and there were a lot of territories like this where they're running shows so frequently, they have to find ways to keep things fresh while keeping a lot of the same guys year in and year out. And it's an argument for presenting wrestling more like a sport, which allows for greater consistency in terms of drawing, even if you don't have the same heights, where you've got sort of a base and it's presented in a serious, credible manner. And there aren't as many, you don't do as much hot shotting, you don't do as many sort of crazy far out there, ideas, because you have sort of this base of people that are tuning in to see sort of the way things ebb and flow on a given week in this sort of long-term struggle to prove who's the best. Wrestling in Louisville goes back forever, with not literally forever, with an important clarification from my notes, with Stanislaus Nabisco, Joe Stecker, Jim Londos, Ed Strangler, Louis Luthez.
Actually, that's pretty much forever. That's going way back.
Yeah, and the like were competing there. They have a lineup from 1933 with Dick Shikat and Sandor Szabo, so going way back. And when St. Louis became the center of the NWA, Louisville benefited from being closely located to St. Louis at that point. Well, it's still centrally located to St. Louis, but at that point, St. Louis was the center of the whole thing. And I didn't know it, but Louisville is less than a 4-hour drive from St. Louis, at least today. So there really was the potential for those two cities to be very
Was
much
it in a
linked together.
different place back then?
Well,
Did they move Louisville? Did they move St. Louis?
The reason why I said that was that I'm not sure what the highway system
Yeah.
was back then. So it might have been a longer ride at that point in time. Although maybe it wasn't. I'm not sure.
I knew what you meant.
Well, who knows? I say wacky things all the time. What's he talking about now? So yeah. I mean, although in spite of that, the fact that it was so closely located to St. Louis, Louisville during the period we're talking about, the 70 to 75, was much more tied to Memphis and the southern cities in that territory than the Sam Mushnick Wrestling Club, which. Kind of, well, I mean, I guess sort of pros and cons, but it goes to the earlier point that you get less in the way of big stars. There's a ton of research put into the history, like when tag team matches started in Louisville, the biggest draws in the 1940s, the discovery that a big Mildred Burke match that was reputed to have drawn 18,000 for a show actually drew that. It's an aggregate total for over a few shows, so it wasn't as successful as was being framed by a lot of people. But after being a successful part of the territory for many years, Louisville went dark for 5 years. What happened was Jim Barnett, who was the big power player at the time, left for Australia, and Dick the Bruiser's Indianapolis office took over, which is never a good sign, given the reputation of Dick the Bruiser as a promoter. So unfortunately, he just sort of gave up on Louisville in short order, and the territory went dark. Then in 1969, 1970, Jerry Jarrett was gaining power in the Memphis promotion, and he saw some of these cities that were being underserved or unserved at all, and got television in them. So he got television in Lexington, Evansville, Louisville, and that led to the return of wrestling in the region. And the priorities of the territory at the time were apparently Nashville, Birmingham, and Chattanooga as the top cities. And again, I mean, this speaks to the point about not necessarily the biggest stars. These are sort of the, Chattanooga being one of your crown jewels. You're not necessarily going to have Dusty Rhodes in every week. So Tojo Yamamoto, Jerry Jarrett, and Johnny Walker, Wrestling 2, are the most familiar, although not at that time, are the most familiar names among the early regulars. And the Von Brauners are pushed heavily on the heel side. Jarrett and Yamamoto are pretty consistent as top draws there, top stars there rather, for the 5-year period being covered. You do get the occasional drop in early from an NWA champion like Dory Funk Jr. Defending against Johnny Walker in October of 1970, but it's definitely rare in the early years of this period. And tag teams were actually very important to the territory. The Von Brauners I mentioned, Don and Al Green, and it was a territory where tag teams were very important, which may speak to why Cornette seems to value tag teams later. Wilbur Snyder was in from time to time, which surprised me since I associate him with from a different era, and not necessarily that time period. Jackie Fargo then joins the mix, and he's one of the big stars of the region too. He'd be a big star as a single, and they'd also bring in his various family members that had been tag team partners from time to time. Roughhouse Fargo, a very colorful gimmick, and Don Fargo as well would be in from time to time. And then later on, they did a thing where they were all together, which was sort of the big reuniting after years. He goes into the famous Jerry Jarrett versus Don Green scaffold match from August of 1971. That was one of the biggest matches ever in Louisville. It had a big crowd, raised ticket prices, and I actually don't recall. There's a DVD that comes with a book that has a scaffold match from that period. I'm forgetting now because I watched the DVD a while before reading the book, but I think that it's actually of the Jerry Jarrett versus Don Green scaffold match. It's a very early scaffold match from that period with Jerry Jarrett, with a very rudimentary and not so high scaffold match, which I think at the time must have came across as really impressive. But if the first scaffold match you've seen is the Midnight Express versus the Road Warriors, where they were so much higher up, it's not as impressive. Bobby Green. Bobby. Is there a Bobby Green, or did I just make up that name? Bobby Green is a fighter. He's an MMA fighter. Bobby Heenan shows up in 1972.
Todd, you know what I've said about mistakes? Come on.
You don't make them?
You're not allowed to ask that. That's in the handbook.
Kevin Sullivan came in as well. So you're starting to get some familiar names, but in general, the lineups are very consistent with the same guys. And it's not like those Memphis results either, where they're bringing in all these big stars to come in and face Lawler. Louisville, it's sort of the same crew for large stretches. Lawler does finally make his way in, and he is, along with Fargo and Jaron Yamamoto, probably your biggest stars of the territory. He starts, as I mentioned earlier, as a heel tag team with a guy named Jim White. And if they have pictures of them in the book, and they just look like this sort of generic, pro wrestling tag team from the 70s with, sort of bodies from that period and facial hair, and they just sort of look like, they look like 1970s wrestlers. It's sort of funny that Jerry Lawler has had such longevity over the years, and has sort of moved away from that period of wrestling. They did draw well in Louisville, even with Lawler as a heel and a very young guy, and so that segues in him to becoming a single star as a heel and then as a babyface. For a ton of earlier cards, they have just the lineups, not the results. But later, Cornette started recording the results, so he has the results in full later on. And there's a lot of guesswork as to what happened with the earlier results, with the book noting what likely happened for various matches based on the surrounding cards and sort of doing some guesswork as to what was going on, based on having the lineups, but not always the results. Lou Thesz comes in 1973 to team with Jackie Fargo and Tojo Yamamoto, and he really stands out on the cards, having a name like that. Thesz, it's sort of amazing that Thesz was still a full-time regular wrestler. At the time, Briscoe and Funk were the NWA champions, but there he is, wrestling with Fargo and Jerry Lawler and some of those other guys. Although in general, as alluded to, you sort of get the same mid-level names page after page, and then you see a more impressive lineup, but it's sort of a rarity. And sometimes the more impressive lineups are actually lineups that from other cities that are in there as supplements to tell some story about what was going on at the time in Memphis or somewhere else, to sort of complement what's in the Louisville results. In the later years of the 70 to 75 period, you start seeing more big names. And I think it's because the territory had proven that it could draw. They don't have firm results in terms of the numbers, but they would get a lot more dates on bigger guys. And I think that's reflective of the territory taking off. Andre the Giant was in for a handicap match in 74. Jack Briscoe came in to defend the NWA title in 74 against Jerry Lawler, and then 75 against Ron Fuller, who people may remember. Well, actually, was it Rob Fuller or Ron? I'm actually not sure now, so I won't say that. Dick the Bruiser came in, the Sheik, Bobo Brazil. The Mongolian Stomper and the Sheik actually debut. Actually, I'm not sure about debut, but they came in for separate matches on the same show, which must have been wild. And they're sort of, I can imagine them sort of feeling like the other guys undermining them because they had such sort of similar wild man gimmicks. And Stomper had a full-fledged run and was very successful. In particular, a big violent feud that Cornette talks about with Bob Armstrong. He wasn't a big name at the time, but a young Iron Sheik appeared in the territory in 1974 as well. And there's also a lot of discussion about what's going on in Memphis, since that was the center of the territory. This was the period of the big Jackie Fargo, Jerry Lawler feud that was such a success and making a lot of money and establishing Lawler as the king of Memphis, which he would do for 40 years. And it did very well in Louisville too. Lawler got really hot and was probably the most successful business run of the period. Was him in his big push as a babyface. Cornette's famously very negative on what wrestling has become in terms of not being very believable and and sort of a sillier product, and I guess. But when he's booked, you can see some touches that aren't that believable in their own right. In terms of some of the goofy characters that he's had, Boo Bradley and did I talk? I don't remember if I talked about Boo Bradley and the cat last week. Actually, I think I might have edited that out from my notes. But Tammy Sitch in her book confirmed that, in fact, I think was it Boots the cat was the name of the cat in Smoky Mountain. I'm going to quickly look that up. Anyway, she confirmed that the cat did not in fact die, and that they did a switch. Boots the cat, yes, I was right. They did the switch, and Boots the cat was not killed in a sack. So that was I was relieved too, Wade.
Yes, I'm very relieved. This is big moment here.
Yes, and I think it reflects better on Chris Candido that he didn't kill a cat.
Yeah.
So good for him, not killing the cat. Anyway, you got stuff like Boots the cat and some of the silliness or the various sort of things that were going on there. And frequently looking in the results of Louisville, you can see some of the earlier angles from the sort of like the goofy Roughhouse Fargo character to there was a mummy that came in for a run in Louisville, and Cornette, of course, famously, but he did a mummy gimmick too with James Mitchell that really bombed in Smoky Mountain. And so you can you can look at some of the sillier aspects of Louisville wrestling during that time period. And I think, Cornette saw that as a kid, and it sort of just became accepted as a part of wrestling. And so that was something that he was willing to take in, whereas stuff that he didn't see as part of his childhood, was something that he wasn't as willing to take in. I think we all do that. And I think it's sort of part of why the business has changed, is that a lot of people grew up on Vince McMahon's wrestling, and Vince McMahon's wrestling was presented more tongue-in-cheek, more goofy than a lot of the territories, with Memphis being a notable exception. And Louisville was sort of a satellite territory of Memphis in some ways. And so that changed the ways that younger fans perceive the business should be, and for better and for worse. In 1975, Lawler and Bill Dundee had their feud come into Louisville, and they'd be going at each other for another decade. There's even a little discussion of the Outlaw promotion in Louisville, Phil Golden's All Star Wrestling, which featured the Von Brauners and lesser talent, including Angelo Pop. Not as lesser talent, actually, is one of the bigger talent that they had, but Angelo Poffo, another famous outlaw, came in later. Overall, I put in my third tier out of my 5 tiers of books. I think it's a fun look through history, but as mentioned, it's not the most interesting territory with the same mid-level stars year after year. I sort of gave you some of the highlights and the stuff that struck me as more interesting, but there also is a lot of stuff that I think is more mundane as far as just sort of, week-to-week feuds between Jerry Jarrett and Tojo Yamamoto, or more teaming up during this time period, over long periods of time, that isn't as interesting to people that don't know the Louisville territory. But I still recommend it. It's a fun look back. And as I said, I wish there were more books like this, because it was very enjoyable, and I like learning about various different territories from people that are willing to sort of put in the work to try to really unpack what was going on in the territory, as opposed to sort of just the rose-colored glasses to whatever was happening.
Yes. No, that sounds like a good book. And again, it's always nice when there's another puzzle piece in the not matrix, in the collage of wrestling territories in history, when another puzzle piece is added to there'll never be a complete picture, but a worthy puzzle piece added to trying to get a more complete picture of the history of the industry.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the mailbag and knock out a few current events questions, and then we'll shift to conclude to UFC in a preview of what's coming up. We got a question from Richard from Atlanta, and he says, a scenario that I might see happening is Undertaker showing up on Raw and saying he will not fight against Shane. This was written before Monday, so you can answer in that context. But fight for Shane. This would leave Vince in a position where he seems like he's nervous when he decides to go with the one man who has always benefited from Stephanie and Triple H's run on top, and that is the company man, John Cena. This would be a great way to turn Cena heel, setting up a person who can be booed in Dallas by the WrestleMania IWC crowd, as well as having someone to feud against Roman Reigns, who the people would hate more than Roman himself. Personally, I would have Cena beat and retire Taker to set up Cena as the biggest heel in years, and it could keep Roman face to feud against him. All this depends on if Cena's healthy by Mania, of course, and I really think he will be. Well, that's good optimism. Todd.
Okay, yeah. So obviously it didn't happen. I
It could
don't
happen
think.
Monday.
Uh, yeah, it seems unlikely, but yes, I guess it could happen again on Monday. Or for the first time on Monday. Um, I don't. I don't think they would have introduced. This is. I mean, this relates to the point that Rich was making, but it also relates to a point that other people are making, which is that I don't think they would have introduced Undertaker against Shane first if the plan was Undertaker supporting Shane, because they could have just gone with that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
they could have introduced Shane McMahon and he's going after Vince McMahon, and then they both announce that they're going to be getting their own wrestlers, like the Vince McMahon versus Donald Trump feud with Umaga and Bobby Lashley, and Vince chooses his own guys. I don't. I think that the tease of Undertaker versus Shane McMahon, if it was a tease at the beginning, wouldn't have aided that, which is part of why I wasn't really thinking that was necessarily happening. As far as the heel turn by Cena, it's a tough position because he should have turned years ago. But now the key, in my opinion, is turning Roman Reigns, since
Yeah.
he's a younger guy that they have bigger plans for, and that's the role that gives them the greater chance for succeed. Really, both of them should be heels, but turning Cena and Reigns around the same time weakens the impact of each. I think that it's harder to get both of them over in that role. And if you just turn Cena now and not Reigns, um, I mean, while it would be entertaining, it would backfire spectacularly. Like what would happen is the fans would immediately get behind. I mean, it would be sort of funny because the fans would finally get behind John Cena for the first time.
Yes.
After they turn him heel, if they turn him heel and then feud him with a babyface Roman Reigns, um, which I mean that would part of me kind of wants that to happen just because it would be so deliciously ironic that after years and years of trying to make John Cena babyface, much to the fans' chagrin and refusing to do it, that they turn him heel. And instantaneously he would be the most over he'd been as a babyface for years if the opponent was Roman Reigns. So that'd be funny, but there are issues there. So yeah, I mean, in terms of Cena in general, my thought would be this guy should still have his heel run, if for no other reason, because I think people will remember him better if he has that. They let fans get that out of that system, and then when he does the Hall of Fame stuff like that, I think there will be less backlash to him because got him in that role they've been looking for the whole time, and I think it would lessen some of the negativity towards him over all the years. I still think he should be turning heel, but given that I think Roman Reigns should be turning heel at WrestleMania, and I do think he is turning heel at WrestleMania, that's really the time to also be doing it with John Cena. So I guess that's sort of my bottom line thoughts on that.
Yep. I'm with you on that. Another sort of related question here. Same major players. Robin from London says, I love Todd's scenario.